Wow. Hey, much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Thanks for tuning in once again. Really appreciate you taking the time to do that as always. Today, we're just going to get on to part 9 of this series, Ancient and Modern Britons. We're going to get into another chapter of this great book we've been reading. If you have missed the previous episodes, all you have to do is go to my playlist tab and you will see the playlist called Ancient and Modern Britons, and you'll see all previous 8 parts. Here they are, and you got a lot of good drop here, so you don't want to miss that. Make sure to catch up if you're new to this series. We're gonna go over a lot of good information today. It's the last chapter of book 1 of this volume 1, so he's gonna go in. We're gonna read a lot, so I hope you're ready for that. I hope you guys enjoy it. A lot of good, interesting information that has been left out of our classrooms, or at least the way they tell us, right? They want to whitewash everything. But we are in a time where the truth is coming out, all right? So don't practice cognitive dissonance, and have an open mind and verify all the information. Let's get started. So we're going to continue reading from the book Ancient and Modern Britons. This is volume 1 still, written by David MacRitchie, introduction by William Preston. And we go to chapter 14 today. This is page 265. And it says here, the Scots of ancient Scotia, now Ireland, having spread themselves over the greater part of that province of our country, which has become known by their name, the earlier Maori of Scotland, having been seated in that territory for a longer period than their swarthy comrades of the southwest, and a later flood of negre gentes, or Negro people, dubglas or dubgiles, or black foreigners, having invaded and ruled over a large portion of northern and western Scotland. It is clear that the inhabitants of various districts of North Britain ought to show their connection with the still existent Tory clans of our country, generally, whom we conventionally style Gypsies. These, as we have seen, were till quite recently Picts, and to some extent they are still Moors, like their forefathers. Therefore, we need not, and indeed cannot, distinguish between an early Scot and an early Pict, since although somewhat different in manners, they resemble each other closely enough in complexion and temperament to be equally the ancestors of certain divisions of the modern Gypsy race. As equally also they may be regarded as ancestors of certain among the civilized Melanochroi of the British Islands, but these, having long ago given up their distinctive habits, do not now differ from any other portion of the civilized population, and are therefore out of court. The famous League of the Black Douglases, for example, may either be regarded as wild Scots of Galloway or as Galloway Picts. So also those untamable Grahames who were expelled the country may have belonged to either of the same 2 divisions, or in these and other instances where the first record of a black race cannot be traced beyond the date of the Danish invasion, that race may have sprung from black, Danish, or other kindred stock. All right, so we've gone over the anthropological studies of the original people out of these places, and they are describing them as swarthy people in the anthropological books. The 10th century Kenneth, king of Alban, who was known as Dub Niger or The black seems, however, to have been a Scot, all right? He ain't coming from Africa, he was a Scot. And accordingly, his swarthy complexion was quite in keeping with his supposed descent, all right? It was common, these folks were swarthy, his ancestors as well as him, and he's a Scot. From him, it may be assumed those Maor Moors of Fife or Fifth, who came to bear the name of Macduff, are also descended. They, at any rate, do not appear in history until shortly after the death of Dub, and as there does not seem to have been any other Dub or black distinguished by that epithet at that time, and as the Macduffs come on the stage as men of high rank, it is reasonable to assume that the blacks whose sons they were was the celebrated Kenneth or Niger of the 10th century. Sebald, in his History of Fife, says that as Niger and Rufus were names of families amongst the Romans from the color and complexion of men, so it seems Duff was from the swarthy and black color of those of the tribe or clan of Macduff. All right, the Macduffs, they were swarthy or so-called black people. Thus, in this swarthy tribe, we may detect originals of these Fifeshire Gypsies, whose ancestral habits of plundering and Morris dancing, as well as the equally ancient practice of polygamy, are all particularized by Mr. Simpson. The Fifeshire Gypsies, of course, represent the irreconciliables of the race, who only partially united their blood with that of the whites, dodge the hijack, who were so averse to the newer faith and more sober habits that prevailed in late times that they are not even yet properly within the pale of civilization. As already insisted upon, such Tories have only been conservative of their ancestral habits in a limited degree. The higher qualities of the race or races they represent have long ago become the property of the heterogeneous modern British nation, which has received some of its most powerful impulses from its origin. Of those veritable Macduffs, the sons of the black, we see a specimen so recently as the reign of Queen Mary in the person of Black Mr. John Spence, was principal deviser of the murder of Darnley, and whose family point to the lion rampant in their arms as proving their descent from the semi-royal Macdub, like the Black Douglases and other Scoto-Pictish tribes. All right, so all swarthy people, remember the previous chapters. Those Macduffs who desired to retain the political power of their ancestors gradually identified themselves with the winning races, Normans and others, until, as in similar cases, the nominal heads of such families are, at the darkest, Melanocroi, and often Sanctocroi, their claim to Pictish blood being no stronger than that of a certain Virginian families to the blood of Pocahontas, whose descendants they certainly are. Perhaps this Black Mr. John Hens may be taken as one of the latest examples of the genuine Moor or Pict. They're talking about a melanated person here who still retained a great deal of his ancestral rank. By last century, the aristocratic descent of the purest blooded sons of the black, still remaining in the province over which their great ancestor ruled, is displayed in the attitude held by the Lochgelly band of gypsies, who looked upon such a chief as George Drummond, himself a chief of importance among his own people, as quite inferior to themselves and nothing better than a beggar tinkler. Of those Macduffs, that became gradually less and less Moorish in blood and habits. When they say Moorish, they mean dark complexion. We need not speak here. It is questionable how far Shah Macduff, second son of a 12th century Thane of Fife, was a Moor in blood. All right, a Moor in blood, a so-called black man. At any rate, he comes on the stage of history as an aide-de-camp of King Malcolm in his wars against the rebellious Moors of the district of Moravia, or Moravia, rebellious Moors, yeah, Moravia, Moravian, Slavs, yeah, there was Swarty or so-called black Moravians or Slavs. And look how this so-called black man, right, King Malcolm, is going to war against the so-called rebellious Moors, right? Shout out to 432, the Drop Radio. More on more war. All Swarty people. It's not about color. All right, Moravia. Don't forget that. Future video. Who's the Moravians? This does not argue that those Moors were not his distant kinsmen, for history shows us 1,000 instances of tribes and nations of this similar type uniting for political reasons against an enemy composed of equally heterogeneous ingredients. But it is likely that this Shah, or Sak, was to some extent a Moor, though like the good Sir James Douglas, a Moor that was on the side of modern civilization and the spread of Christian ideas. Whatever his own exact lineage, his wife was apparently a Norman being, a daughter of Hugh of Montgomery, one of his brother captains in the expedition against the Moray men, the rebellious Moors, the Moravians. To what extent the chiefs and aristocracy of northeastern Scotland were, by this time, Norman, it is difficult and even impossible to decide. But at any rate, from this Shah Macduff and his wife Giles of Montgomery descends one of the most important sections of the previously existent confederacy of Clan Chattan, Chattan, or the tribe of cats. For this Macduff and his posterity came to bear the surname of Macintosh. All right, listen, which it is believed signifies Mac on Toisish, the son of the chief or leader, one of that large class of names latterly associated with Ireland and certain parts of Scotland, but which may have originated among Dutchmen. Listen, as likely as among any other of the many races to whom the prefix Mac or Mag or Maga belongs, Maja. Eventually, in the person of Angus, his sixth successor, the actual captainship of this powerful tribe became vested in the Macintosh line. This Angus having married in the year 1291 Eva, the only child of Dougal Dal, the last chief of the ancient clan Chattan. The lineage and probable origin of the anti-Macintosh captains of Clan Chattan has been a source of much discussion, and many conflicting theories have been broached on this subject. The name of its last chief, Dubgal, or or Blind, would lead one to believe that by the 13th century, and perhaps long before, it had contained a certain amount of the blood of the piratical Black Danes, again, the piratical Black Danes, although the name of Dougal had probably become fossilized sometime previous to its possession by the father-in-law of Angus Macintosh. Whatever the origin of the clans Chattan or Chattan, for the CH receives a guttural pronunciation, it is indubitably ancient. The tribes bearing the mountain cat for crest are visible a long way back, and in various parts of the British Islands. We say such a tribe included under the sons to the king of Rwali, of whom a very old Gaelic poem, given in the Dean of Lismore's book, More, states that one battalion was cat-headed. Cat-headed, huh? Like like jaguar warriors, you mean? And that the same baron was known in Wales is evident from the allusion that Hotspur makes in his petulant tirade against Glendower, and no doubt the correctness of the allusion is borne out by actual facts. The clan Chattan or Chattan was therefore a very early intra-British race, whether it ought to be regarded as originally Black Danish or early Scottish or Pictish. The last designation, in its widest sense, is too wide to lead us to any conclusion, but in its restricted sense, it signifies the Moorish inhabitants of Scotland at the time of the Roman invasion. That's what it means. All these people, all these original clans, right? These are the Highlanders, right? Your Highlanders, MacPhersons, Macintoshes, all your Macs, right here. Who are they again? It just literally just means, in the restricted sense, signifies the Moorish inhabitants of Scotland at the time of the Roman invasion and subsequently. Such Picts, the early Catanachs, listen, or members of the clan Chattan, were popularly believed to be some centuries ago the ballad of Hardinut, as it is given in Alan Ramsay's Evergreen, a collection of Scots poems wrote by the ingenious before 1600, contains the following lines. All right, so excuse if I don't pronounce this right. It says, "Shine he has gained Farhainda Tori, Lord Chattan's land sawide, that Lord a worthy witch was I. Cuhan Faz his courage said, pride, of Pictish race by mother's side. Cuhan Picts ruled Caledon. Lord Chattan claimed the pricely maid. Cuhan he said Pictish crown." Who this particular captain of the clan Chattan was, the ballad does not make sure. If this Hardinude was the Danish king, and the lines, then read grow his dark brown cheeks, say did his dark brown grow, argue a mixture of some such dark blood as that of the Danes. Then the Lord Chattan, listen to this, guys, they describe him as, this is the chief, the captain of the clan Chattan, they describe him as dark brown in this poem. So it's arguing a mixture of some such dark blood as that of the Danes. Then the Lord Chattan of the ballad was a chief of the 11th century. He cannot indeed have belonged to a later period, for then there was no Pictish crown to save, so that whether the princely maid referred to was merely an heiress of the Chattan line, or higher than that, the daughter of the reigning Pictish house, it is evident that many generations before the chiefship of Blind Dougal, the blood of the Chattan chiefs was only semi-Pictish, but that originally the Chattan tribe was purely Pictish is, I think, indicated by the etymology of the name, which, however, is a point for after consideration. Although the lands which King Malcolm granted to the first Macintosh were in the northeast corner of Inverness-shire, and although his descendant Angus, who married the heiress of Clan Chattan, acquired by this marriage the sovereignty of the lands in Lochaber, which formed the home of his adopted tribe, yet this Angus was as much Hebridean in blood as a Norman, for his mother was the daughter of Angus More of Isla, and his maternal uncle married a daughter of Mac Dubgal of Lorne, the head of a very powerful section of the race of black strangers, and his father had apparently been the associate of other island tribes, since it is stated that his death was the outcome of a quarrel arising during a game of draughts, chess, or tables with one of the islanders. Islanders. Therefore, this descendant of Kenneth Veldub, or the Black, of the three Black divisions, had inherited the blood of Hebridean or Danish Moors, so called, right? Black folks, Danes, as well as that of the mainland Picts, mixed with Picts. Listen, a lot of you Highlanders, this is what they are. Although both these streams were apparently neutralized by currents of whiter blood. All right, gosh, the hijack, the mixtures, right? They're saying eventually happened, but they're telling you originally what these people look like. It is to the Hebridean section, however, that we ought to turn if we wish to ascertain whether, as on the mainland in some remote districts, the unmodernized ways of the people resemble those of our modern gypsies, because from its isolated position, this archipelago ought to have been one of the latest territories to conform to modern ways and fashions. The inhabitants generally of the Hebrides are described by Dr. Skene as composed of ingredients closely akin to those that made up the mixed race of Galloway men or Galgidel, that is, they were a compound of Gauls and Gauls. The wars between the Gaidhel and the Gael have been many and of long duration, and they have been closely studied by one eminent scholar in particular. At whatsoever day they began, the Hebridean archipelago appears to have been known as Inchegal, Insegel, or the islands of the foreigners, from an early time. These islands are regarded as the immemorial home of the Picts, and it is probably for this reason that the Gaelic term for an islander, Inesaknak, Inshanok, is also a synonym for an Indian. Listen. Uh-oh, islanders means Indian. Who's these islanders? Where did the Picts come from? Otherwise, the natives of this archipelago are styled Deucalidones. Sounds like Lacadones. And the ocean all around them, the Deucaledonian Sea. A later race of Gauls or foreigners than the Picts, however, was that of the Northmen, or Fingaus, who were Gentiles of pure color, or white men, or more fair, so-called fair. Were they really was? That word Fin, it means fair or pure, so it doesn't really mean white. With them in point of time came the opposing type of Gauls, known to the Gaels as black heathen. So we got so-called black Gauls, and there's Gaels, right? Gaels and Gaels, don't get confused. This is what I'm saying. They've been mixing all these people together. And to history as Danes, the black heathen, the Gaels. Then these with Picts, Gauls, and subsequent Normans and others make up a great jumble of races within the Hebridean area. But we can at least ascertain something about certain sections of those islanders. And of course, in searching for gypsy-like people, our attention must be chiefly directed to those of black complexion. All right? So I'm going to repeat that again. If we're going to be searching, he says, for gypsy-like people, our attention must be chiefly directed to those of black complexion. All right? Remember my gypsy video. Go check it out if you haven't. The traditional inhabitants of some of these islands, it will be remembered, are actually known as gypsies, for they are styled Seotoks and Seofoks, described as naked wild men living in caves and with plaited locks, all right, with braids, plaited locks with braids, okay? And Seofok or Geobok, for the transition is one of the easiest possible, and Gaelic is rendered a gypsy by the dictionaries. Let us look then at the gypsy-like portions of the Hebridean people, whether these are of black Danish or Scoto-Pictish origin. In a previous chapter, the physical characteristics of some of these islanders have already been glanced at. All right. Plus, we have read anthropological books, right, describing these people, different sources. It was seen that Martin, writing more than a century ago, stated that the people of the island of Skye were, for the most part, black. Those of Judah were generally black of complexion, and the Aran Islanders were generally brown and some of a black complexion. So we've read the actual primary sources where he's getting this from. I've shown you in my Swarty Europe videos. Okay, go check them out again. Catch up on the previous presentation so you're not so behind on what we're reading or understanding, right? Again, I've shown those sources. These are facts, anthropology. These people were so-called black, right? Melanated people. At least one native of the Isle of Rasai was black by nature, as well as by name. And the clan of MacRaw, though not at the time of Boswell's visit inhabiting the island which had taken their name, contained among its members some who were as black and wild in their appearance as any American savages, whatever. Just like what? Just like the American Indians as black and wild. All right, you see how he compared it and literally told you that the Indians were also so-called black or melanated as well. Of the Islesmen that rode, the doctor and himself among the islands, Boswell, it was also noticed, remarked, that they seemed so like wild Indians, that a very little imagination was necessary to give one an impression of being upon an American river. Okay? Just like Indians. They seem so like wild Indians. We're talking about the original Pictish people, the original Hebrideans, these islanders. Huh? They remind me so much of the Indians that a very little imagination was necessary to give one an impression of being upon an American river. Right? One of them he particularized as a robust, black-haired fellow, half-naked and bareheaded, something between a wild Indian and an English tar. All right. It was also noticed that half a century back, the people of Harris were thus described. In general, the natives are of small stature. Their cheekbones are rather prominent, and the nose is invariably short, the space between it and the chin being disproportionately long. The complexion is of all tints, many shades. Many individuals are as dark as mulattoes. Like mulattoes? While a later writer still, Mr. J.F. Campbell, has spoken of the short, dark natives of Barra, and has described a girl whom he saw among them, but not of them, in these terms. Her hair was as black as night, and her clear dark eyes glittered through the peat smoke. Her complexion was dark, like the primary sources, and her features so unlike those who sat about her, that I asked if she were a native of the island, and learned that she was a Highland girl. Nope, she's from the Highlands. She's not an islander. So you see, she was dark, and she was coming from the Highlands. Her face generally reminded the observer of the Nineveh sculptures, and she looking like an old world person. And her face is seen in Saint Sebastian. In all these cases, we can find every reason for understanding why the tales of the West Highlands should abound with encounters friendly and inimical with black people. In such a rough and general survey as this, taken in the descendants of so many different races, there must necessarily arise several apparent inconsistencies. At one point, the black races are seen to be of short stature, confirming the opinion of Professor Huxley. At another, as in Harris, they are taller than the whites. All right? Different types of melanated people in Scotland, short and tall. It has been maintained or insinuated that the reason why black is a synonym for everything atrocious is because the black races of Scotland and elsewhere were fierce, cruel, and lustful. and that in the Hebrides, as elsewhere, certain races were absolute savages. There can be no doubt. So it says here, but on the other hand, some of the writers quoted, such as the one who describes the Harris mulattoes, ascribe to the dark-hued natives the possession of intellectual and moral attributes of the highest kind, attributes which rendered the Harrissian mulattoes the superiors of the Harrissian whites in the opinion of their visitor, and the same testimony is afforded by the 17th century writer, formerly quoted, who pictured to us the male inhabitants of Mul in the year 1688 as wearing a sporran or purse very similar to that worn by some Hottentot races, just like the Khoisan, listen, and for the same purpose. Yet, in spite of their scanty dress, he does not fill the state most emphatically that the men of this race were brave and handsome, and the women characterized by a natural beauty and a graceful modesty. But such inconsistencies must be overlooked in a hasty sketch that takes in all races and all periods. A detailed examination of the various types, if this be yet possible, would explain away such superficial contradictions to a certainty. It is enough at present to assume that all varieties of humanity were at one time low and brutal, and that a race, black or white, that in one century was essentially savage can be accurately described as refined and gentle in a later century. If in the interval it has been subjected to such an ennobling influence as Christianity. All right, so you guys see how they're measuring civilized by being a Christian. So you gotta dodge the hijack. To one man, he might seem, to another man, he might seem like a savage, but what is he really a savage? Those Sioux or Gypsies of the Hebrides then were actual black savages. Dodge the hijack. Although, like all savages, in parentheses, they possessed a civilization and polity of their own. All right, they were civilized. They bear different race names, and historians have told us much about them and their fierce nature, how they plundered and ravaged the early homes of learning and religion in Ireland, in the Isles, and throughout the larger of the main British islands. Chiefly, they are remembered as Danes or Black Heathen. One of these was previously cited in the person of a 15th century pirate known as Alan MacRitchie, figured in an ancient Gaelic poem as the one demon of the Gael, Inche Gael's great curse, the bald head, heavy, worthless boar, an allusion, it was supposed, to his boar-crested helmet, the fierce ravager of church and cross, who ravaged Iona and relic Oran, and several other such titles. From what period those swarthy, again, swarthy, piratical races began to make their savage depredations, it is impossible to say, but they did not cease with bald-headed Alan and his following of devils. All right, so remember the previous chapter, how why these people were started raiding, right? They had been dispossessed of their lands by some other people, right? A century after his death, this Diak element still existed. Buchanan, in his description of the Hebrides, informs us that the island of Uist has numerous caves covered with heath, the lurking places of robbers, and that opposite Loch Broom is situated the island Eu Eileen Dub, the island of the blacks, okay? Eileen Dub, the island of the blacks, almost wholly covered with wood and of service only to the robbers who lurk there to surprise travelers, while more to the north lies Gruinort, also darkened with wood and infested with robbers. And Pennant, writing at Dunvegan last century and referring to a period antecedent to his own, tells us that each chieftain of the civilized races had his armor bearer who preceded his master in a time of war, and by my author's account, in time of peace, for they went armed even to church in the manner the North Americans do at the present in the frontier settlement, and for the same reason, the dread of savages, or because the Indian raids, right? And why was the Indians raiding these settlements? Remember, they're just trying to get their land back and their freedom back, just like these raiding gypsies we read in the previous chapter. But those savages were only the irreconcilables of their race. As on the borders, we saw that, although it took 3 generations to do it, and although many lives were sacrificed in the struggle, the once savage Moss troopers became to a great extent peaceful, law-abiding members of the Commonwealth. So in the Hebrides, a glance at the 17th century measures adopted by the governing powers reveals to us that the process of civilization and the preaching of Christianity for the second time was steadily going on. Therefore, since the converted Iselmen or Islemen were of the same blood as the Moravian pirates, these Islemen or Iselmen ought to have retained something of their former manners, even after they had begun to adopt those that now prevailed throughout the greater part of Britain. Let us first glance at some of their habitations. The simplest of all these was of wholly inartificial character. It is still in use. We talk of cave dwellers as though they are separated from us by a great stretch of time. The cave dwellers of Europe, that is to say, but it is a simple fact that even at this day, there are many of our fellow countrymen who are cave dwellers. This has been pointed out more than once by Dr. Arthur Mitchell, and quite recently in a paper of the antiquities of the islands of Colonsay and Oronsay. All right. So this book was written in 1884, guys, right? So he's saying there was a lot of people still living in caves. Nowadays, the caves in these islands do not appear to be inhabited from year's end to year's end, but only for some months at a time. But in Martin's time, the caves of Judah were apparently regularly inhabited. Right now I'm thinking about, like Paul Cook's videos, how he's going around finding all these so-called caves, right? But they're actually buildings, and you can tell people were living in them. What if this is what they're talking about, right? The geopolymer, huh? Continues, says the summer habitations of these Judah islanders are particularly described by Pennant, and they closely resemble the dwellings of the natives of Lochaber, as pictured by that traveler. All right. Again, I just want to point out Judah, right? Change the R to D. Judah. Judah. Lochaber, which lies some distance to the northeast of Judah, though within easy reach of it by water, was stated to be the country of the Moorish, again, Moorish or melanated people, right? Dark-skinned people or semi-Pictish tribe of the Catanags or clan Chattan, all right? Of the Highlanders' original ancestors, the original clans, or the tribe of the Cats, right? Of their dwellings. At the time of his first visit to the Highlands, Pennant says, the houses of the peasants in Lochaber are the most wretched that can be imagined, framed of upright poles, which are wattled. The roof is formed of boughs, like a wigwam. Again, like a wigwam. Listen, guys. And the whole is covered with sods. In his second tour, he describes the summer dwelling of the Judah Islanders in similar terms. These formed a grotesque group. Some were oblong, many conic, like teepees, conic, like a teepee, and so low that entrance is forbidden without creeping through the little opening, which has no other door than a faggot or of birch twigs placed there occasionally. They are constructed of branches of trees covered with sods. The furniture, a bed of heath placed on a bank of sod, 2 blankets and a rug, some dairy vessels, and above certain pendant shelves made of basket work to hold the cheese, the produce of the summer. The annex woodcut is copied from the illustrations in Pennant's travels. All right, guys, look at this image, look at this drawing, how he's describing the homes of these islanders, these people who are swarthy, these people who are being compared to, be almost like the American Indians, Look at their houses looking like teepees. Come on now, wigwams and teepees. It says wigwams of the natives of the island of Judah in the year 1772. All right, these are melanated, so-called black folks. But they're drawing them white. That's the funny thing, right? They're describing them black, but they're drawing them white. It says copied from Pennant's second tour. This is what he drew. All right. Now this is distinctly an encampment of gypsies, or of Labs, or Northern Asiatics, or North Americans. North Americans, okay? Oh, it's getting hot, right? We opening Pandora's box. We're getting there. Little by little, the connections, you're gonna start seeing them. It is the tough-covered game, or kota, of the Labs, and its architecture is visibly the same as that of the Red Indian camp, although I am not aware that the material turf is employed by any American tribe. As to its being gypsy, there is as little doubt. In cold countries, they find shelter in caves or build huts sunk in the earth and cover them with sods laid on poles. And Layden says of the Jetholm gypsies, on Jeta's banks the vagrant gypsies place their turf-built cots, a sunburnt swarthy race, again a sunburnt swarthy race, these so-called gypsies, or people coming out of Egypt, ancient Egypt, to marry America. While the same description is given of the dwellings of the border Scots, just like the border Scots and just like the Highlanders we heard earlier, right? During the early part of the 15th century, back in colonial times. We're not talking about modern day, today. When Aeneas Silvius, afterwards Pius II, made an adventurous visit into Scotland, he found that most of the houses on the Scottish borders were not even huts, as they were generally a small breastwork composed of mud or such materials as were at hand and raised to a sufficient height by 3 or 4 poles meeting at top and covered with straw or turf, while those of the villages were a little better and had no door but a cow's hide suspended at the entrance. All right. Well, I just want to point out here, they're letting you know what they had, the means to build these things. So they're making mud stuff and with sticks because that's what they had around. They've been in North America. You guys know we got cotton, we got so much materials and resources to be able to build better quality wigwams, or as they call them, huts. All right. So it says here in short, these turf-built wigwams are the dwellings of the Scoto Picts. Listen, Scoto Picts, or Egyptian Moors, or swarthy melanated Egyptians. What Egyptians? Coming out of the real Egypt, guys. Come on. Whether we look at these people in their latest individual form, or as they appeared in the Hebrides last century, or at an earlier date than that, when they formed an important political entity in the British Islands, which their civilized and hybrid descendants still do, hybrid, and their dwellings form one of the very numerous links that unite the painted Moors, or tattooed ones, right, of Scotland with certain kindred races in Europe, Asia, and America. Okay, we're talking about ancient people, we're talking about the Picts, right? When they say painted Moors, we got this in previous chapters. The Picts, so-called gypsies, these swarthy people, these so-called Moors, they just mean melanated people of Scotland. All right, certain things are just like people all over the world, including America, related to America, kindred races. The turf-built cots or wigwams, which Aeneas Silvius pictures as the common habitation of the border Scots, Moors, or Picts during the early part of the 15th century. At that period, still one of the most powerful sections of the population of Scotland, the chief of those Douglases, even threatening the supremacy of the Norman faction. Himself a man of the greatest power and living in a stone-built castle, those wigwams of the Scottish borders were to be seen quite recently on Jeta's banks, and others of the same description formed the summer habitations of the Judah islanders in the year 1772. But this sod-covered wigwam can hardly be said to be the common form of gypsy dwelling at the present day. Indeed, it seems to have been given up by the jet-home gypsies since Leyden wrote. Or why did they stop? Is it the same people? At any rate, the usual dwelling of the modern gypsy is the canvas tent of oval or oblong shape. The structure is clearly that of the most nomadic of gypsies and liable to be taken down at any moment. And just as the sod-covered wigwam is a survival of the common habitation of historical 15th century Scots, so is this tent nothing more than a relic of the movable dwellings of the poorer Scots. Chattan gives a curious description of that mode of encampment, which he saw after the Battle of Pict in 1547. Here now, to say somewhat of the manner of their camp, as they had no pavilions or round houses of any commendable compass, so were there few other tents with posts, as the used manner of making is, and of these few also, none of above 20-foot length, but most far under. These white ridges, as I call them, that as we stood on Foxside Brae, did make so great muster toward us, which I did take then to be a number of tenties. When we came, we found it a linen drapery of the coarser cambric and dede, for it was all of canvas sheets, and were where the tentacles, or rather cabins and couches of their soldiers, the which, much after the common building of their country beside, had they framed of 4 sticks about an ell long apiece, whereof 2 fastened together at one end aloft, and the 2 endies beneath stuck in the ground, all ell asunder, standing in fashion like the bows of a sow's joke. Over 2 such bows, one as it were at their head, the other at their feet, they stretched the sheet down on both sides, whereby their cabin became roofed like a rich but skank shut at both ends, and not very close beneath on the sides, unless their sticks were the shorter, or their wives the more liberal, to lend them larger napery. Howbeit, when they had lined them and stuffed them so thick with straw, with the weather, as it was not very cold, when they were once couched, they were as warm as they had been wrapped in horse's dung. Chattan's account of Somerset's expedition, all right, that's what we just read, quoted in the appendix to Marmion, note 3. In this description, we see plainly the ordinary tent of the modern nomadic gypsy, which style of dwelling was once, so far as the Egyptian Scots are concerned, the common building of their country, the ones who came from ancient Tamari, the real Egypt. It is not likely that British gypsies, in parentheses, in recent times have made use of the hides of animals as coverings for their tents or wigwams, for the obvious reason that in a civilized country, these could not well be obtained except by purchase. Sir Thomas Dick Lauder, however, in his story of Glengarry's Revenge, seems to indicate the use of skin-covered tents when he speaks of the little group of black botis that at such times form the chief's temporary place of encampment. A Highland boti or booth, the same as booth, boutique or boudica, and other forms. I bet you that's where they get bodega, right? Bodega. Radically, a dwelling, more strictly, a place to be in, according to Mr. Skeet. And in this instance, it is of a temporary kind. In a hunting expedition such as that alluded to, the radius made booth would be one of the skins stretched over a framework of branches, and probably this was the kind in use in such instances. The people whom we are accustomed to regard as gypsies are not everywhere identical in dress and customs, nor is this to be wondered at, since gypsies are merely the residuum of various epochs and various nationalities, all right? Not the same as the original. With regard to the early Scoto Egyptians or Scoto Picts, dress, for example, seems to have been regarded as a superfluity. This has already been noticed, all right? We got this on the last chapters, how they dress like the Indians. He was describing them. Captain Bird in those letters, which Scott has frequently quoted, says, in an appendix to letter 22, In Ireland, ancient Scotia, all right, Ireland is ancient Scotia. A few centuries ago, the lower class seldom encumbered themselves with dress of any kind within doors, and there is every reason to suppose that this was also the case among their brethren in Scotland. The extracts made in a previous chapter concerning the naked rebels, or Elizabeths, and earlier reigns quite corroborated this. Spencer also, in describing a class of Irishmen called Carrows, whose sole occupation was gambling, tells us they wander up and down, living upon cards and dice. All right, playing games, right? Cards and dice. The which, though they have little or nothing of their own, yet they will play for much money, which if they win, they waste most lightly, and if they lose, they pay us slenderly. Campion is more particular when he informs us of these carols. They play away mantle and all to the bare skin, and then trust themselves in straw or in leaves. The same interesting history also states the style of living among these native Irish chiefs, a dreadfully loose designation, since the race of these Irishmen, in parentheses, is not indicated by it, was characteristic of a people whose barbarism had only been indurated and confirmed by conquest. The attendants of the great O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone, for the most part were beardless boys without shirts, who in the frost wade as familiarly through rivers as water spaniels. All right, so when they're saying these naked rebels, I just want to point out they don't mean literally all naked. They don't got a shirt on. They might have, their private parts covered or some pants or something like the American Indians did. That's what we were saying, and that's what we were reading in previous chapters. As a match to the home life of O'Neill was that of O'Kane, a great chieftain of Ulster, according to the description of the Bohemian nobleman gives by Fiennes Morrison, who, on visiting him, tells us he was met at the door with 16 women, all naked, except their loose mantles, whereof 8 or 10 were very fair, and 2 seemed very nymphs, with which strange sight into the nobleman's eyes being dazzled, they led him into the house, and there sitting down by the fire, with crossed legs, like tailors, and so low as could not but offend chaste eyes, desired him to sit down with them. Soon after, O'Kane, the lord of the country, came in, all naked, excepting a loose mantle and shoes, which he put off as soon as he came in, and entertaining the baron, after his best manner in the Latin tongue, desired him to put off his apparel, which he thought to be a burden to him, and to sit naked by the fire with this naked company. It is surely unnecessary to add that the astounded Bohemian excused himself from complying. These and the former extracts all show that the Pictish contempt for clothing was held by certain tribes of ancient Scotia during many centuries, and the extract just made is only one of many asserting the same thing. Dr. Jameson, in his remarks upon the word sorner or sornar, makes an additional quotation from Fiennes Morrison to the same effect as the one just given. Those sorners, it will be remembered, were particularly named, along with sturdy beggars, fancied fools, and others in the acts of the Stuart kings, which statutes were enacted with the express aim of putting down sorning and similar customs that were totally opposed to modern civilization, though quite lawful in the society to which they belonged. Dr. Jameson, like the Scotch historian of the Gypsies, clearly identifies sorners with tinklers, or cards, or bards, sturdy beggars, spadewives, fortune tellers, and horse coopers, or cowpers. And it will be seen from an examination of their characteristics that sorners were undoubtedly Egyptians or Scots, Egyptians/Scots from the real Egypt, Gypsies coming out of Egypt, Exodus, to marry America. Mr. Simpson correctly defines sorners as forcible obstruders, and Dr. Jameson derives the word from sorehong or soreheng, a tribute exacted by certain chiefs in Ireland from their dependents. This soreheng seems to be only another name for the custom which he describes as styled cochetting, or perhaps the former word denotes the tribute exacted, and the latter the manner of exacting it. Besides the soreheng, The Irish lords, at least in the time of Elizabeth, subjected their tenants to a pretty severe visitation, which they called coshering. Fiennes Morrison gives a strange account of their manners in a passage in which he mentions this custom. They sleep, he says, under the canopy of heaven, or in a porthouse of clay, or in a cabin made of boughs of trees and covered with turfy, a Hebridean wigwam, in short. For such are the dwellings of the very Lord among them, and in such places they make fear in the midst of the room, and round about they sleep upon the ground, without straw or other thing under them, lying all in a circle about the fear, with their feet toward it, and their bodies being naked, they cover their heads and upper parts with their mantles, which they first make very wet, steeping them in water of purpose. For they find that when their bodies have once warmed the wet mantles, the smoke of them keeps their bodies in temperate heat all the night following. And this manner of lodging, not only the mere Irish lords and their followers use, but even some of the English Irish lords and their followers, when after the old but tyrannical and prohibited manner vulgarly called ushering, they go, as it were, on progress, to lie upon their tenants till they have consumed all the victuals that the poor men can get. That's from the Initiatory P, Volume 3, page 164. This then is sorting, and it is plain that the custom was one that could not be endured in a properly civilized society. It was once as common in Scotland as in Ireland, as the various statues of the Gypsies show. And indeed, the descendants of the Sorners, now as low in the social scale as they were once high, have not yet forgotten that era. They still tell their children of the good old times, the golden age of the Gypsies, when they could wander hither and thither with little molestation and live in a measure at free quarters wherever they went. The foregoing extracts have all endorsed Captain Bird's statement that in Ireland a few centuries ago, the lower class seldom encumbered themselves with dress of any kind within doors, and they have also made it evident that the upper classes, at any rate, and some districts held equally broad views. It is astonishing how long such notions lingered on. A visitor to the territory and islands known as the Roses of Donegal, in the northwest corner of Ireland, gives us a picture of the manners of the natives at that time of his visit, the years 1753 and 1754, very much like those sketches of Fiennes Morrison. So he says, their houses were but mere huts, consisting chiefly of one room, with the fire in the middle of it. But what surprised Mr. N most was their extraordinary mode of accommodation for the night's repose. All the family lay together in one bed, and in any visitors came in the evening, they too slept with them, for they set no bounds to their hospitality. To provide lodging for the whole company, the youngest men were sent out for heath or bent bushes, which they spread across the floor, to a length sufficient for the number present, and in the breadth about 6 feet. Over this litter, the mistress of the house laid part of a long plaid or blanket, on which the others, having stripped off their clothes, lay down as fast as they could, men and women, together all naked. Then the mistress, having drawn the rest of the blanket over them, lay down, last herself naked also. This they call a thoroughbed, and Mr. N was perhaps the only person who had ever before worn a shirt in it. Yet this hospitable people, so friendly and generous to those they knew, appeared at first to strangers to be wild and fierce, but after a little acquaintance proved gentle and humane, especially to those they were in awe of. For in all their simplicity there was a strong mixture of cunning. Thus about the time of Pennant's visit to the Hebrides, a section of a race akin to some Hebrideans lived in wigwams such as those of the islanders and other gypsies in Britain or out of it, and possessed ideas of propriety quite different from those now in vogue, though identical with those possessed by their ancestors and by the lapse of today, as pictured by Mr. Du Chaillu, the ideas in short of all gypsies past and present. After his statement as to the primitive ideas of some of the people of Ireland a few centuries ago, Captain Bird adds, and there is every reason to suppose that this was also the case among their brethren in Scotland. The fact that their dwellings were one-roomed wigwams is of itself almost a sufficient proof of the correctness of this supposition, but it is also confirmed by the writer of the above last century article, in conversation with an elderly gentleman who had about 40 years ago made the tour of North Britain. When I communicated what I had learned concerning the roses, he assured me that my description of these islanders is an exact picture of what he had seen in the Scottish Highlands and the Orkney Islands. All right, so he's saying, hey, just like it looked just like the Highlanders. The description given of the dwellings of certain gypsies who find shelter in caves or build huts sunk in the earth and cover them with sods laid on poles is therefore a description of the dwellings of the Judah Islanders in past times, so that the traditional definition of Sioux-Talks as naked wild men living in caves is a very correct one. Those Judah Islanders were Sioux-Talks, Sioux-Fox, Geobox, or Gypsies. They lived in caves, and there is good reason to suppose that at one period they, like their brethren in Ireland, went naked, that they at one stage of their existence or in certain particular instances were wild is equally clear. So wild because they live in the forest and stuff, right? Not because they were actually wild, but maybe they had gone into a state of wildness after they had fell off, which in Gaelic means a cave. So it says Uam, which in Gaelic means a cave, is also, according to MacAlpine, a chief of savages, a terrible fellow, and of course is literally a cave dweller. And all history tells us that whether under historical names or more recently as pirates and robbers, certain fierce and savage tribes harassed the peaceable inhabitants of the Hebrides up till a very recent date. When and to what extent the non-piratical Hebrideans were peaceable people may be a matter of dispute. The terms savage and barbarous are applied most indiscriminately by such writers as those already referred to, the reference being the Polectania de Rebus Albanicis. So lately as the year 1615, the Bishop of Argyll complains to King James that the parties of your Majesty's kingdom committed to my spiritual overseek are so barbarous that without severe animadversion they cannot be cohibited from their from that wanton savage behavior. Therefore, while it is unsafe to generalize from particular instances, there is much reason for believing that the peaceable natives of the Hebrides attained that condition of peace by a process very similar to that by which their kingdom on the borders became civilized. It is true that peaceful and savage tribes of kindred stock may be found living in close proximity to each other, as for example, the quiet orderly Sunni Indians of Arizona and their neighbors, the intractable and marauding Apaches. It is also true that men are to a great extent hostile or friendly in proportion to the amount of friendliness shown by those who come in contact with them. But still making allowances for all these things, it seems very probable that the orderly Hebrideans who dwelt in caves and wigwams were the civilized descendants of the naked wild men, that those wild men were the far down descendants of a civilization as old as Egypt is beside the question, as old as Tamari, ancient America, ancient mound builders, as old, that they knew how to carve chessmen from the ivory of the walrus and how to play the game when they had carved them. And it's a simple fact. And they had inherited a vast deal more than that. But it is a curious and undisputable truth that a high civilization and very savage habits may be found in unison, of which the cannibal feasts of the civilized races of ancient Mexico offer an example. Gosh, the hijack. All right, you see how he just made everybody in ancient Mexico a cannibal? Come on now, that's so wrong. That's so much of a generalization. And show me which one you're talking about. All right. Therefore, it is no error of diction to say that those fierce marauding pirates of the Hebrides and elsewhere were savages, whatever remnants they may have retained of a remote civilization. To return from the uncertain region of theory to the firmer ground of fact, let us continue to search for any additional reasons for the conviction that the early historic nations of ancient Scotia, listen, and Scotland were nothing else than nations of gypsies coming out of Egypt, and in the meantime, let us chiefly regard the Hebrideans. As already remarked, gypsies are composed so many various nations arriving in these islands at various dates. We're talking about the modern ones. that we cannot expect to find among them an unvarying sameness in dress, manners, and speech, nor indeed do we find this among their straggling representatives at the present day. Those that we have looked at just now took after the earliest Moors of Scotland. Moors, melanated folks, the original so-called black people of Scotland, and their disregard for clothing. But the Hebridean archipelago was tenanted by many races, and it is probable that scarcely two out of its many islands are identical in the race mixture of their natives, or receive those various races in the same proportion and the same order of time. We find therefore that the fashions of the people of Skye and the islands near it, as these fashions existed at a period anterior to Martin's visit, are not identical with those of such islands as Judah and Mull. He describes the dress, almost out of a vogue by his time, of these islanders in the following term. The first habit worn by persons of distinction in the islands was a lenny croit, from the Irish word lenny, which signifies a shirt, and croit, saffron, because their shirt was dyed with that herb. That ordinary number of ells used to make this robe was 24. It was the upper garb reaching below the knees and was tied with a belt around the middle, but the islanders have laid it aside about 100 years ago. The shoes anciently were a piece of the hide of a deer cow or horse with the hair on, being tied behind before with a point of leather. The ancient dress worn by the women, and which is yet worn by some of the vulgar, called arisat, is a white plaid having a few small stripes of black, blue, and red. It reached from the neck to the heels, and was tied before on the breast with a buckle of silver or brass, according to the quality of the person. I have seen some of the former of 100 marks of value. It was brought as an ordinary pewter plate, the whole curiously engraven with various animals, etc. There was a lesser buckle, which was worn in the middle of the larger, and above 2 ounces weight. It had in the center a large piece of crystal, or some finer stone, and this was settled around with several finer stones of a lesser size. The plaid, being plaited all around, was tied with a belt below the breast. The belt was of leather, and several pieces of silver intermixed with the leather like a chain. The lower end of the belt has a piece of plate about 8 inches long and 3 in breadth, curiously engraven, the end which was adorned with the fine stones or pieces of red coral. They wore sleeves of scarlet, close at the end as men's vests, with gold lace round them, having plate buttons set with fine stones. The headdress was a fine kerchief of linen, straight about the head, hanging down the back taper-wise. A large lock of hair hangs down their cheeks above their breasts, the lower end tied with a knot of ribbons. To complete the picture, be it remembered that the descendants of these people were, at the date of Martin's visit, for the most part, black. All right, so-called black. He's just trying to remind you, just remember. In his voyage of St. Kilda, he uses similar terms in portraying the appearance of the natives of that island, which shows that the ancient fashions were still retained there at the date of his visit. For the inhabitants of St. Kilda, then as now, were descended from people of Skye and others of the Hebrides. It is noticeable, however, that the majority of the St. Kildians were of a fair complexion, the others being somewhat vaguely described as not fair. His picture of the dress of their women, though partly a repetition of that just quoted, is nevertheless worth extracting. The women wear upon their heads a linen dress straight before and drawn to a small point behind below the shoulders, 1.5 feet in length, and a lock of about 60 hairs hanging down each cheek. To their breast, the lower end tied with a knot. Their plate, which is the upper garment, is fastened upon their breasts with a large round buckle of brass in form of circle. The buckles anciently worn by the steward's wives were of silver, but the present steward's wife makes no use of either this dress or buckle. The women inhabiting this isle wear no shoes nor stockings in the summer time. The ordinary and only shoes are made of the necks of solan geese, which they cut above the eyes. The crown of the head serves for the heel, the whole skin being cut close at the breast, which end being sewed the foot enters into it as into a piece of narrow stocking. This shoe does not last about 5 days, And if the downy side be next the ground, then not above 3 or 4. However, there are plenty of them, some thousand being cached, or as they term it, stolen, every March. Now, what manner of people are these? Certainly not the conventional Highlanders of the modern artist. Here we have a swarthy race, all right? Not like how they draw them today, he says. This is actually a swarthy race, whose men wear long tunics of saffron color, listen, with tunics on, and whose women are clothed in a most picturesque and foreign fashion. Round their tawny foreheads, all right, tawny, they wear a fine kerchief of linen or linen, hanging down the back taper-wise. Their long black hair hangs down on either breast and plaited, all right, and braids going down the, come on, the chest. Listen, just like the American Indian, locks, right, plaited locks. Come on now. The lower end tied with a knot of ribbons. Their flowing white garment, having a few small stripes of black, blue, and red, falls from the neck to the heels, and is gathered in front with a broad plate of silver or brass, curiously engraven with various animals, and having in the middle of it a lesser buckle set around with precious stones. Their sleeves are a scarlet cloth embroidered with gold lace, and having plate buttons set with fine stones. The white robe is belted in below the breast with a leather belt, having several pieces of silver intermixed with a leather like a chain. And at its lower end there is a piece of plate about 8 inches long and 3 in breadth, curiously engraven, the end of which is adorned with fine stones or pieces of red coral. Of the dress of the gypsies, regarded as such, I have seen no picture as such an early date as this, but the remarks made upon this point in the encyclopedia article indicate a fashion closely resembling that of Martin's Islanders. Gypsies formerly had a distinctive costume, consisting of a turban-like headdress, again turban-like headdress of many colors, together with a large cloak worn after the fashion of a toga over a long, loose underskirt. The English gypsy woman may be known by her bright silk handkerchief, her curiously plaited hair, her massy rings, her coral or bead necklace, and by the mongin guno, a tablecloth arranged backwise over her back. On the other hand, the dress of the children upon the continent is simple, not to say scanty. This last feature attracted the attention of Dr. Johnson during his Hebridean tour, and it has already been particularly dwelt upon here. Burt, letter 22, remarks the same thing. The young children of the ordinary islanders are miserable objects indeed, thought the hijack. I have often seen them come out from the huts early in a cold morning, stark naked. His descriptions relate more closely to the mainland, but the race mixtures of northern and northwestern Scotland resemble those of the Isles. In certain districts to a considerable extent. Another statement of his in the same letter is this: the ordinary girls wear nothing upon their heads until they are married or have a child, except sometimes a fillet of red or blue coarse cloth, of which they are very proud, but often their hair hangs down over the forehead, like that of a wild colt. If they wear stockings, which is very rare, they lay them in plaits, one above another, from the ankle up to the calf, to make their legs appear as near as they can in the form of a cylinder. But I think I have seen something like this among the poor German refugee women and the Moorish men in London. This allusion to Moorish men is very appropriate when describing a custom of a race that was probably descended from the Moor of Scotland, but at first sight, the German refugee women seem a little out of place. But what kind of Germans were expelled from Germany when Bert wrote? All right, yeah, who are they talking about? So late as the time of the celebrated Baron Trenck, a contemporary of Bert, it would appear that Germany was still infested with prodigiously large bands of gypsies. And Grellman, who although his book was not published till nearly 30 years after Bert's, may easily have referred to the period of which Bert speaks, says, some years ago there was such numbers of them in the Duchy of Württemberg that they were seen lying about everywhere. But the government ordered detachments of soldiers to drive them from their holes and lurking places throughout the country, and then transported the congregated swarm. Therefore, the most likely refugees from Germany in the middle of last century were the German gypsies. Whatever the precise pedigree of those swarthy natives, again, swarthy natives of Skye and the neighboring isles, it is not improbable that their blood was chiefly that of the Black Danes. The Hebridean women were dressed in white robes with sleeves of scarlet cloth embroidered with gold lace. It is said of a tribe of 9th century Danes who landed in Fife that they wore over their armor white shirts stitched with red silk. And the famous 11th century chief Thorfinn, who was one of the largest men in point of stature, ugly of aspect, black-haired, sharp-featured, and somewhat tawny, was enveloped in a white mantle on the day when, with his 2 warships of 20 benches, he rowed into the harbor of Salé of the Norway coast and stepped on the quarter deck of Harold Sigurdsson's galley. And as a counterpart to the gold lace, the broad plates of silver, and the buckles set around with precious stones, which form part of the attire of the Hebridean women. We have the gilt helmet of the same Thorfinn, and the dress of Kara, the son of Solmon, who was a powerful chief in the inner Hebrides, many centuries before the days that Martin writes about. We are told that when Kara, I remember what Kara means so-called black too, was returning with his fleet of 10 galleys after receiving tribute from the islanders on behalf of Earl Sigurd. He interrupted a sea fight between the sons of Niall, Grim, and Helgi with others Icelanders, and 13 galley loads of pirates or Vikings, Danes, the scene of the engagement being apparently among the outer Hebrides. Kara, the son of Solmon, is thus described. On that vessel which went foremost, a man stood at the mast. He was in a silken jacket and had a golden helmet, but the hair was both long and fair. This man had a gold-studded spear in his hand. Farther, a 12th century Earl of the Orkneys is stated to have met his death by putting on a linen garment, newly made and white as snow, embroidered with gold, which garment had apparently been contaminated by some poisonous preparation, huh? It's almost like when they're saying they gave the Indians these blankets with diseases, huh? These silks and jewels and ornamentations of gold and silver were probably inherited by Martin's Hebrideans from this source, to a considerable extent at any rate, for although our Scottish antiquaries have collected gold brooches of exquisite workmanship that belong to a period far older than that date of the Danish invasions, and although the Scoto-Egyptians and Pictish Moors have bequeathed many other Orientalisms to their descendants everywhere, yet it is likely that since the Danish was the latest Eastern element in the Hebrides, many of the 17th century Hebridean fashions were Danish. But speculations upon this point are, at this juncture, somewhat out of place. There is still in Ireland one colony, at least, of a people that has preserved wonderfully its ancient habits, and that suggests in its fashions a kinship with Martin's natives of Skye, and in its physical characteristics a descent from the dark-skinned race that peopled a portion of the island of Lewis and other small islands, all right? What? A dark-skinned race. That territory, in short, that is included in the modern parish of Harris, it will be remembered that of the Harisians generally, it was said in the earlier part of this century, that their distinctive features were these: the cheekbones rather prominent, all right, high cheekbones, the nose invariably short, the space between it and the chin disproportionately long, the complexion of all tints. Many of these Harrisons were as dark as mulattoes, and these were superior in stature and strength to their fair-skinned brethren. The Sky people at Martin's time were, for the most part, black, so-called black, right? And their earlier fashions have just been described. The Irish colony, now to be glanced at, occupies a small territory known as the Cladog, at the inner end of the Galway Bay and just outside of Galway Harbor. The Cladog, says a recent writer, is entirely inhabited by the fishermen and their families. These form quite a clan and are exceedingly clannish in their sentiments, not allowing a stranger to set foot in their village or meddle with their fishing. Such a one would find it as much as his wife was worth to fish anywhere within the Cladog district. These people live quite apart in a world of their own, subsisting almost entirely on the produce of their fishing, and they talk Irish with an accent peculiar to themselves. Every market day, the women may be seen in the market with fish for sale. They wear red petticoats, over which gay cotton dresses are looped upon, and bright kerchiefs cover their abundant tresses of jet black hair. These are allowed to fall in a peak on the neck. The women are of a peculiar type, as are also their husbands, tall, dark, muscular, and with shapely limbs, though on a large scale. A finer race could hardly be seen 30 years ago than the Clada people, all right? The dark-skinned people they're talking about here. At that time, they could boast of no less than 1,000 strong, able-bodied men, thoroughly acquainted with the sea, such as would be a credit to our navy. But since the famine, the race has degenerated sadly. These people have a king of their own, or had a few years ago, who is chosen from amongst the oldest and most renowned of the Clada families, and is arbitrator of all the disputes that may arise among his subjects, so that they scarcely ever appear before a court of justice. The physiognomy of these Clada people is not described, but it is not improbable that it will be found to correspond with that of the tall, dark Harisians, just like them, whom they resemble in stature and strength, while the headdress of their women reminds one of the fine kerchief of linen straight about the head, hanging down the back taper-wise, that was once worn by the dusky women, of the inner Hebrides. And these again, the bright kerchief of Cladog and that of Skye, are, as already seen, simply varieties of the bright silk handkerchief that used to constitute the headdress of the English gypsy woman. For all these people are virtually gypsies, sea gypsies, Algerines, Malays, or whatever they may best be compared to. The Clada people are no doubt harmless, well-meaning, and virtuous when suitably dealt with, but let anyone attempt to encroach upon the fictions of which they believe themselves the absolute owners, and it is as much as his life is worth. This is precisely the state of things in the Hebrides in 1635. For Asmekli, as the islanders comes in troops and companies out of the isles where they dwell, to the isles and locks where the fishes are ta'en, and their volatile spoils, his majesty's subject of their fishes, and sometimes of their victuals, and other furniture and perseus stain of their lives. In either case, the casus belli is the same. An irreconcilable section refuses to acknowledge the ascendancy of a newer power that has become, by the almost unanimous consent of the nation, the arbiter of the nation's destiny. This irreconcilable section, whether in the Hebrides, on the Galway coast, on the Scoto-English border, or among the scattered tribes of modern gypsies, by virtue of its intense conservatism, refuses to recognize that the old order has yielded place to new, adheres to its ancient laws and customs, and consequently finds that these occasionally lead to a direct conflict with those ideas accepted by the nation generally. How far this is the cause of certain local disturbances at the present day need not be discussed here, but it is certain that if such moderns as the Claddagh folk and the Gypsies were to obey the commands of their own self-chosen kings in opposition to those of the national government, they would in certain events place themselves in direct antagonisms to what we understand as law, and the only remedy for such an evil would be that adopted by the national government of Scotland in their dealings with the Scots proper or Tories of the borders. 2 or 3 centuries ago, a patient toleration of their differences, as far as that was consistent with peace and the progress of civilization, and in inveterate cases, a distinct assertion of governmental power. But nowadays, the ancestral customs still retained by Gypsies are inoffensive. Their fiercest ancestors, whether as Hebridean pirates or as border mossers, or in whatsoever form, were either killed off as intractable marauders or else became orderly and civilized people, and their offspring now constitute a large proportion of the British nation. It is more to the purpose, however, to reflect that those Galway coast people are plainly Gypsies in their attire, in their adherence to ancestral customs, and their obedience to a king who is, in their eyes, of ancient royal descent, as also in their swarthy complexion. All right? And because of that, because of their swarthy complexion, and probably in their language. Other points of resemblance between the Pictish races of history and that portion of our population that has longest adhered to Pictish fashions are these. It is remarked more than once in the history of the Gypsies of Scotland that it was the custom of Gypsy chiefs, if not of their followers, to openly practice polygamy. This, it was noticed, was also a custom of the border thieves, mossers, or Scots to whom this practice, or something very like it, was known as hand fasten. The relations between the sexes was even less formal than this in the Western Islands, as Dr. Skene informs us, and such usages were not put down by law until the beginning of the 17th century. But it is everywhere apparent that Gypsies are only the remnants of the wilder races of the country. All right, that's why they put it in parentheses. Mr. Simpson has virtually recognized this when he says that they seem to have been classed with our own native vagabonds, moss trappers, border and highland thieves, broken clans, and masterless men. In his eyes, of course, Gypsies were not our own native vagabonds, but foreigners, which at one time they certainly were. But he says, or he sees, what one cannot help seeing, that the acts directed against them as Gypsies were one with those directed against highland and border banditti. The statutes quoted by Captain Byrd with regard to the Sorners of the Highlands are word for word the same as those quoted by Mr. Simpson in relation to Gypsies, and virtually the same as those that Scott cites when he describes the suppression of the border mossers, Scots, or thieves. The act in Byrd's appendix, which he holds as relating to Highlanders and Islemen as distinct from other natives of the British Islands, are especially aimed at Sorners, sturdy beggars, idle bellies, thieves, and intolerable oppressors, limers, deleting and no thing else but and cruel and detestable mortoris, fiery raisins, sorceries, etc., bards, and profess pleasants, fancied fools or clowns, pretending liberty to bard and flatter, vagabonds, bards, jugglers, and such like, the entertainment and bearing with whom was accounted amongst the remanent abuses or remnant abuses which without reformation has defiled the whole isles. All the qualities of these particular Highlanders and Islemen were at one time embraced within the appellation Egyptian, all right, coming out of ancient Egypt, Tamari, and the nickname Scot vagabond, and Pict, painted or tattooed, all right? They had tattoos all over their bodies. The Picts, whether these names be held as applying to the earlier Moors and Egyptians of early Britain, or to the somewhat later invasions of such races of Picts and Scots as were known to be Christianized Britons by the titles of Saracens and Black Heathen, and as on the borders, so in the highlands and isles. The time when such people were most vigorously suppressed was the reign of James VI of Scotland and James I of Great Britain, of which time Andrew, Lord Stewart, was able to report on his return from the Hebrides that he had broken and destroyed the Hael, Hol, Galleys, Lumphadis, Long Warburgers, and Berlingis that he could find in only part of the illis he resorted unto. The drift of all this indiscriminate destruction of vessels, adds Captain Burt, of every description, except as much as might be necessary for conveying His Majesty's rents, was to encourage the trade of fishing, which the peaceable subjects of the in-country walled entertaining in the cities illis to the honor and benefit of the Ale kingdom. Those war galleys were the vessels of the people who have been already spoken of as pirates, savages, naked wildmen living in caves, Sutogs or Gypsies. So, when the Stuarts came around, and by the time of King James, the famous King James, he persecuted these dark-skinned original peoples or indigenous to these areas, right? These people that were indigenously there for a long time, even though they were foreigners, they're saying, remember, coming out of Egypt. The people who lurked in every creek and wooded island of the Hebrides, as depicted by the scholarly Tudor of that first king of United Britain, and whose reign so many laws were passed against those idlers and marauders. Buchanan's description of the Hebrides has already been extracted from opposite Loch Broom is situate the island Au, almost wholly covered with wood, and and of service only to the robbers who lurked there to surprise travelers. More to the north lies Grunord, also darkened with wood and infested with robbers. Half a mile from Rasay or Ras Isle, is Rona, covered with wood and heath, and a deep bay. It has a harbor, dangerous for voyagers, as it affords a covert for pirates when to surprise the passengers. And lying off the site of what is now Bradford and Skye was Paba, infamous for robberies, where the thieves from their lurking places in the woods with which it is covered intercept the unwary travelers. Those Hebridean Malays, Algerines, or whatnot, were thus the savages, of whom Pennant speaks, whose depredations were so frequent and so much to be dreaded several centuries ago, that the chiefs of the civilized inhabitants of Skye were accustomed to go armed to church, as did the Puritan settlers in New England, and for the same reason, the dread of savages. No, the same reason is because you had taken over somebody else's land. That's why you had to go with your gun. And they were trying to get it back. They are better known in modern history under their general designation of Vikings or Creekmen, and were plainly the same as those pirates that we lately saw attacking the Icelandic vessels that carried the sons of Niall and the Icelandic merchants. From the time they were first seen in history or tradition down to the days of Buchanan, to which period Pennant reverts, they must have altered greatly in breed, for that embraces a great stretch of time, during which the Deucalidonian archipelago was the scene of unceasing strife, the actors in which were of every variety of British stock, which is almost equivalent to saying every variety of mankind. All right? You see that? You guys hear that? Not just one kind of people. When we talk about all these old British nations or clans or people that are inhabiting these old times, the British Isles, right? Every variety of mankind. But it seems likely that the Creekmen or pirates were chiefly the races of Cimbri, or Black Danes and Mori, or blackamoors of an earlier date, known vaguely as Picti or painted people, and Scots or vagabonds. And there is much reason for believing that the anti-British home of one section of those Scots was Egypt, that the Osman, or men of the East known as Cimbri, Dani, Black Heathen, now remember the Cimbri, they're talking about the Sumerians who mixed in with the Danes and some of the Gales that were there already. They're not the same as original Danes, but people do put them together. All right, remember, check out my Sumerian video. And the Latronis were to some extent a wave of the Black Hun flood that had previously deluged southern Europe, while the earliest blackamoors, whom we regard separately as Picts, though without reason since the nickname applies to all of these races, may also be faintly seen to have migrated westward from Asia. Seem to be, But these points of pedigree and the question as to how far those savages races are represented by the modern British people are matters which there is no room to discuss here. There is nothing inappropriate in styling those piratical Creekmen Malays, so far as character and habits go, and the term is not very faulty otherwise. The swarthy skins and prominent cheekbones of certain Hebrideans connect them very distinctly with the Vikings of the Eastern Archipelago. What? Their swarthy skin. Yeah, connects them with their swarthy brethren, the Vikings, or kindred. Martin points out some characteristics of a plainly Mongoloid nature when he describes the men of St. Kilda. They have generally but very thin beards, and those too do not appear till they arrive at the age of 30, and in some not till after 35. They have all but a few hairs upon the upper lip and point of the chin, and he recalls the Swedish explorer's recent account of North Ugrian people, the Siberian Chukches, when he says, both sexes of the St. Kildians have a lisp, but more especially the women, neither of them pronouncing the letters DG or R, but we are more particularly concerned with the gypsy parallel at present. When Martin said of these same St. Kildians that they marry very young, the women about 13 or 14, he was only stating in advance what the encyclopedia distributor has told us of gypsies. They marry very early. Boys of 14 and girls of 12 are often man and wife, and an equally forcible illustration is afforded by a comparison between the culinary customs of the gypsies and those of other sections of the population of Scotland. Not popularly regarded as gypsies, Mr. Simpson tells us that the ancient method of cooking practiced among the Scottish gypsies is very curious and extremely primitive, and appears to be of the highest antiquity. The gypsies, on such occasions, make use of neither pot, pan, spit, nor oven, and cooking fowls. They twist a strong rope of straw, which they wind very tightly around the fowl, just as it is killed, with the whole of it feathers on, and its entrails untouched. It is then covered with hot peat ashes, and a slow fire is kept up around and about the ashes, till the fowl is sufficiently done. When taken out from the beneath fire, it is stripped of its hull or shell, and half-burned straw rope and feathers, and presents a very fine appearance. It is said likewise, says Bert, speaking of the meaner sort of people in the Hebrides, that they roast a fowl in the embers with the guts and feathers, and when they think it's done enough, they strip off the skin, and then think it fit for table. Again, Captain Bert states that these islanders still retain the custom of boiling their beef in the hide, and Mr. Simpson caps this by remarking that these singular people, the gypsies of Scotland, also boil the flesh of sheep in the skins of the animals, adding, with unintentional aptness, like the Scottish soldiers in their wars with the English nation, when their camp kettles were nothing but the hides of the oxen, suspended from poles, driven into the ground. At page 350 of his book, Mr. Simpson informs us that the most conservative of all divisions of the Scottish gypsies is that division whose men are thinkers, and whose women are engaged in the sale of articles made from horn. This particular tribe is known, he says, to other quasi-gypsies as gypsies, And he adds that this horn making is so essentially a gypsy craft that an ordinary potter or mugger becomes alarmed if one asks whether he ever makes horn spoons, for this is virtually asking him if he is a gypsy. A fact, as Mr. Simpson and Mr. Leland agree in saying that every gypsy tries, if possible, to conceal. For it must be remembered that to be by habit and repute an Egyptian was to be under the ban of the law and in danger of one's life, not many generations ago. Uh-oh. And it is not to be wondered at if the feeling still survives. And this essentially gypsy custom, the making, and inferentially, the using horn spoons, is as old custom of the Scots as are the cooking fashions just described, or as any other of the trades which have lately been pointed out as the common property of Egyptians, right? Remember, we're talking about ancient Egyptians to marry out of Egypt, of popular speech, and the Scots of history, right? Talking about ancient. Remember our other videos, who settled in these areas in ancient times. And looking at the Scots, Egyptians or Picts of the south of Scotland, it was noticed that they were jongleurs as much as jugglers or anything else, that they were, in short, the minstrels of the Scottish border. Examples of these were seen in a Jamie Allen, the Gypsy and Northumberland piper, Odd Piper Allen, Jamie's father, Johnny Fa, and his six of his people, each with pair of union pipes beneath his arm. And in the story of James V, when disguised as a gaberlunzie or sturdy beggar, he is described as equipped with his pipes and his wallets, without which he would not have been in character. In the ballad of the abduction of the Countess of Cassilis by Johnny Fa, the gypsies came to my Lord Cassilis' jet, and oh, but they sang bonny. And to take an example, out of a more southern land of the Gauls, in which the Scoto-Egyptians were found so early as the 4th century, the best speaker of gypsy at the present day is a harper. As before observed, it is not necessary to confine our regards to one particular musical instrument. It is enough that the gypsy races were peculiarly musical. They were jongleurs, minstrels, bards, but their favorite instruments seem clearly to have been the harp, the violin, and the bagpipes. Speaking of the Hebrideans of 300 years ago, Buchanan says, instead of trumpet, they use a bagpipe. They are exceedingly fond of music and employ harps of a peculiar kind, some of which are strung with brass, and some with catgut. In playing, they strike the wires either with a quill or with their nails suffered to grow long for the purpose. But their grand ambition is to adorn their harps with great quantities of silver and gems. Those who are too poor to afford jewels, substituting crystals in their stead. Their songs are not inelegant, and in general celebrate the praises of brave men. Their bards seldom choose any other subject. They speak the ancient Gaelic language, a little altered. Tennant, referring to the Highlanders generally, tells us that in former times the harp was the favorite instrument, covered with leather and hung with wire, but at present it quite lost. Bagpipes are supposed to have been introduced by the Danes. This is very doubtful. The oldest are played with the mouth, the loudest and most ear-piercing of any wind music. The others played with the fingers only are of Irish origin. The Trum of Jews harp would not merit the mention among the Highland instruments of music, if it was not to prove its origin and antiquity. Vocal music was such in vogue amongst them, and their songs were chiefly in praise of their ancient heroes. I was told that they still have fragments of the story of Fingal and others, which they carol as they go along. All right, so real quick, just want to point out, he pointed out, they spoke in ancient Gaelic. Remember what we learned about the ancient Gaelic, its origins. Again, coming out of so-called Hebrew, mother tongue, right? We're talking about so-called Egyptians coming out of Egypt, speaking ancient Hebrew, Paleo, Okay, a few specimens of these harps, jeweled and decorated with dragones and scrollwork of the most delicate workmanship, are yet extant, and two of them for example, are particularly described in the Proceedings of the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland from 1880-81, but the use of them in the Scottish Highlands and Isles by wandering or resident bards has apparently quite died out. One still does see in Scotland the larger and more angular harp played by occasional wandering street minstrels to investigate whose antecedents might perhaps prove very interesting. But as compared with the bagpipes, the harp in Scotland is nowhere. The bagpipes, of course, still keep their ground there to a considerable extent, and people who have never taken the trouble to examine the history of this instrument are in very many cases impressed with the idea that it belongs exclusively to Scotland, even in the face of the fact that a similar instrument, though with less to recommend it, drones and shrieks through our thoroughfares every day, played upon by swarthy Piferari, again, swarthy Piferari, whose birthplace is certainly not Scotland. But anyone who has paid any attention to the subject knows that the bagpipes are not of spontaneous Scottish growth, and indeed, Tennant has just told us that they are believed to have been brought into Scotland by the Black Heathen, the Danes. All right, bagpipes coming from black folks. If so, this would at once account for their use in southern Europe, in which they are in such strong infusion of the swarthy Hun blood. Just like in parts of Asia, right? They also had like this type of bagpipes. Here's a connection. And it would account also for the presence of the same instrument in England, without requiring to look farther back than the Danish inroads and conquests. For it unquestionably belongs to South as well as to North Britain. Shakespeare knew this when he spoke of the drone of a Lincolnshire bagpipe, and Chaucer too, when he said of his Pilgrim Miller, a bagpipe cowdy he blow when sown. And this Miller is of other importance in this respect, because there is much reason to believe that he was typical of a certain race. The physical peculiarities that led one to believe this may be glanced at afterwards, but it is striking thing that possessing the gypsy qualification of bagpiper, he was also a jangler and goliardes, that is a jongleur and a buffoon, regarding both of which callings something has already been said. Shakespeare seems to have regarded the bagpipe as identified with Lincolnshire, and probably it was an instrument quite alien to the people of Warwickshire. Whatever may be the races from which these two populations were chiefly descended, there is a record of some English pipers who played before James IV of Scotland at Edinburgh in the year 1489, but there is no clue as to the locality from which they came. We are told that in 1489, a band of English pipers came to Edinburgh, and they played at the castle gate, where His Majesty heard them and rewarded them with 12 demis. In 1491, 3 English pipers were heard by the King of Linlithgow, and paid 7 unicorns. Of course, the word piper need not necessarily signify a bagpiper, although it does so in Scotland today, but it seems very probable that the term pipes and pipers have generally been used to denote this particular instrument and the players on it. In a song of the year 1591, The Hunting of Cupid by George Pale, the words, "When swains' sweet pipes are puffed," seems to hint at the bagpipe. If swains be held to mean rustics, then more than one passage in Barclay's Eclogues, written 80 years or so before the hunting of Cupid, shows very clearly that the bagpipe was the swain's dearest instrument. Amintas, in one of these Eclogues, speaking of the rustics of England and the way in which they spend their Sundays, says that if they once hear a bagpipe or a drone, unknown to elm or oak be they gone. They use they to dance, to gumbat, and to rage. Such is the custom and use of the village. And Faustus, a shepherd, is made to admit, as soon as we have here a bagpipe or a drone, then leave we labor, there is our money gone. If any difference ever existed between a bagpipe and a drone, It must have been infinitesimal, and neither of these names appear to have been inapplicable to those swains, sweet pipes, which are referred to in the hunting of Cupid. Two of these swains, or shepherds, figure in another of Barclay's eclogues, and one of them says of other, with us was thou wont to sing full merrily, and to lie piping oftentime among the floors, that time thy beasts were feeding among ours. And although this swain was now a tattered outcast, yet could he pipe and finger well a drone. Here it seems evident that this swain's sweet pipe was a drone, or bagpipe, and nothing else. Again, in Butler's account of the custom known as the riding of the stag, the procession was headed by men playing upon bagpipes of the loudest drones, with a snuffing broken winded tones. And it may be questioned whether the whifflers in the same procession were not also bagpipers. Halliwell says that whifflers were generally pipers and horn blowers who headed a procession and cleared the way for it. And Wright adds, particularly in the Corporation of Norwich, and Shakespeare in the Return of Henry V from France speaks of the deep-mouthed sea, which like a mighty whiffler for the king seems to prepare his way, which is suggestive rather of the bagpipe than of anything else. However, whiffler must have been a somewhat comprehensive term if it included all kinds of pipers and also horn blowers. A writer upon this subject makes these remarks. The bagpipe was apparently in common use some centuries ago, both in England and Scotland, and the old Scottish poem of Pebbles to the play. The bagpipe is the pipe among the merry May-Day folks. Hub Kiley and Cardrone gathered them out thick fold. The bagpipe blew and they outthrew out of the tones untold. But the bagpipe appears to have begun to retire about the time of the Reformation, an event that, or somewhat later period, proven that by this time the bagpipe must have retired to the hills. At whatever date it retired to the hills in Scotland, the references already made to the Northumbrian gypsy pipers, Alan Perelfils the Younger, of whom at any rate seems to have lived into this century, would apparently denote that the bagpipe died a harder death in the chiefly lowland county of Northumberland, a district which was once a stronghold of the Black Danes. Indeed, it is evident that when Wordsworth and Leyden, men of the same generation, described as common features of North English and South Scottish life, the bagpipe dining on the midnight moor in barn unlighted, and when their contemporary Mr. Walter Simpson refers to the same features in exactly the same way, if in less poetical terms, it is evident that in various border localities, the bagpipe was an everyday sight so lately as the earlier years of the present century. How long it continued to be so must be known to men acquainted with the manners of the counties lying immediately north and south of the borders, but that the Northumbrian pipes were still played upon by wandering minstrels as recently as 1861 is seen from a passage in one of the border guides books. All right, so remember, this was written in 1884, this book. And it is probable that the caste or caste is even yet not quite extinct in that neighborhood. The bard of 1861 is not specified as a gypsy, but it is almost certain he was one, since Wordsworth, Leyden, and Simpson are unanimous in identifying the instrument with those people. Thus the bagpipe, like the harp, or the dirk, or the oath on the dirk, is not in any way the peculiar property of the Scottish Highlands. These things are all distinctly gypsy or Scythian attributes. Scythian, Saxon, sounds of Isaac, although naturally, like other archaisms, they have lingered longest in remote districts, or among a class of people who are the Tories in the country. That the bagpipe is an instrument identified with England, Ireland, and other parts of Europe, as well as with Scotland, is a fact that has often been pointed out, although there is still, even among educated people, A good deal of ignorance existed in this respect, but how much more incorrect are our notions regarding the manners and customs of the Hebrideans of 3 centuries ago? It may be questioned whether half a dozen people have ever tried to realize the conditions of Hebridean life at that period, but if we have any hazy ideas on the subject, they are surely very far removed from the truth. The truth, in parentheses, is a thing that can never be ascertained by people living 300 years later. All right? That's why you got to go to the primary sources. But if there are any popular beliefs existent as to the life of that time and place, they are surely quite out of keeping with such facts as these quoted in the previous pages. Particular islands of the Hebrides, particular sections, even of some of them, may have differed from others in the appearance of their inhabitants as much as night from day, the presence of at least two wholly different races, all right, at the same time, and in the same districts was clearly indicated by Pennant's reference to the former condition of Skye, when the civilized inhabitants, when armed, even to the church, in the manner of North Americans do at the present in the frontier settlement, and for the same reason, the dread of savages, because they're afraid that the Indians are going to want their land back. Whether the Skymen of today are unmixed, descendants of the civilized Skymen of 300 years ago, the savages haven't been killed off like the Tasmanians or the Red Indians, just like them, the copper-colored Indians, or whether they share the blood of both races is a question which need not be entered into. It is enough that this state of things formerly existed in the island of Skye. The kind of people who have been sought out in this chapter may have constituted a majority among the earlier Hebrideans, or they may not, but they were there, and we know as a fact, therefore, that the archipelago, even down to the time of James VI of Scotland, swarmed with tawny pirates. Tawny, possessing all the characteristics of gypsies, and known to their civilized contemporaries as Egyptians, all right, coming out of the true Egypt or ancient Egypt to marry, and that this section of the Hebrideans possessed the long war canoes mentioned by Andrew, Lord Stewart, in the account of his expedition, undertaken for their suppression, is a conclusion which one has every reason to draw. In the acts for their suppression, these people were described, as we have seen, as sorners, thieves, and intolerable, oppressors, limners, delighting in nothing else but in cruel and detestable murders, fire raisins, and sorceries. All right, so these were acts for their suppression, meaning this was they were labeling them so they can take their lands and just relocate them and just move them away. Whose existence about 300 years ago was among the remanent abuses which, without reformation, had defined the whole Isles. These people were distinctly gypsies. When not so called, they received names which, at the time they were used, signified the same thing. Fletcher of Salton, writing in 1680, states that there were then 100,000 people in Scotland leading the life of gypsies, jockeys, or cards, and that the Highlands of Scotland was an inexhaustible source of beggars, that is, of gypsies, all right? So many gypsies in the Highlands, for gypsy and beggar were then synonymous terms. But beggar, it must be remembered, did not mean an insignificant outcast at that date. A beggar was then a bandit, a powerful and ferocious marauder, an intolerable oppressor. Such a man, in short, as we get a glimpse of in such early accounts of the Scotch gypsies as that brought out by Dr. Pennyquid in the year 1715. These gypsies then constituted one of those abuses that defiled the whole Isles in the reign of James VI of Scotland, and whether lurking in the caves of Uist or in the islands of Gruinort, Rona, Paba, and Eileen Dub, or the island of the blacks. Remember what that means, the island of the blacks, from which hiding places they darted out upon the unwary travelers. They are presented to us as piratical Vikings or Creek men, fit descendants of those black heathen that murdered, robbed, and burned all along our shores as far back as the 9th century, coming under the ban of the governing powers of that day, and apparently forming a part of the same system, so abhorrent to the peaceably disposed community in general, were the sorcerers, bards, jugglers, players at fast and loose, fortune tellers, fancied, fools or professed pleasants, and such like, the kind of people, in short, whose representatives in this country at the present day are described by a student of gypsyology as being impregnated throughout with what he calls gypsiness. Indeed, it is inaccurate to speak of them as forming a part of the same system as that which embraced the masterful beggars, intolerable oppressors, and murderers spoken of above. For one cannot separate the one from the other. The statutes quoted by Mr. Simpson in his 3rd chapter show that the robbers and jugglers were one and the same people. The act that makes reference to the thieves and limners who unite themselves in infamous companies and societies under the commanders, committing open and avowed robberies in all parts, murders, common theft, and pickery, states also that the same marauders do shamefully and mischievously abuse the simple and ignorant people by telling fortunes and using charms and a number of juggling tricks and falsities unworthy to be heard of in a country subject to religion, law, and justice, but that the counterfeit limer and the counterfeit Egyptian and the sturdy beggar and the gypsy, the bard or minstrel, and the card or tinker were only so many varieties of the same species, as is a fact that has been already recorded. And the reason for introducing these characteristics at this point is simply to observe that if the dusky skins, again, the dusky skins, the long side locks, huh? Like Hebrews, like Israelites, with their knotted ribbons, the gypsy kerchief, covered chef, the flowing white dress, the scarlet gold embroidered sleeves, the ornaments of gold, silver, coral, and precious stones that form the most salient features of certain archaic Hebridean communities, and the Indian-like wigwams, that were the dwellings of such people. If these most important particulars have quite been omitted in any pictures of ancient West Highland manners, all right, they didn't show you that the Highlanders lived in wigwams like Indians. So also have such other traits as jugglery, dice throwing, thimble rigging, and the buffoonery of the circus clown, all which were once equally characteristic of West Highland life. For these professed pleasants or pheasants and a fancied fools were nothing else than harlequins and clowns. The bard and the mountebank, the jungler and the juggler were one. A poet like Scott was at liberty, if he chose to imagine a minstrel as a venerable patriarch of a dignified presence, but the few facts we know seem to say that he was a glib-tongued flatterer and a mountebank. Indeed, this minstrel mountebanking had not completely disappeared from the Hebrides several generations after those severe statutes were enacted against him. We get a picture of a harper who made himself a buffoon for his bread, wearing a long fool's cap, bifurcated with bells attached, who wandered through the islands of Barre and Skye at a period subsequent to those statutes by fully 100 years. And whether or not he was the last of his kind, his dress indicates very fairly the appearance of the earliest bards and professed pleasants, who were among the remnant abuses that had defiled the whole isles. There must also certainly be much information still afloat among Gaelic-speaking people with regard to all this class of Hebrideans. For Gaelic, however, it may have altered from time to time, owing to various causes, in whatever may have been its first shape, and at whatever date it may have been first spoken in the British Islands. Gaelic has been the language of the civilized element in the Scottish Highlands, as civilization in parentheses is now understood. And it is not the language of those gypsies, it is not the language native to Highland thinkers and tinker fiddlers at the present day. It is in Gaelic that we hear of the vulgar tongue as black speech. Listen, nor is the language of the Welsh minstrel of today that variety of speech known as Welsh. On the contrary, it is black speech in parentheses or gypsy, black speech. Neither did the earlier harpers and pipers of the sister island employ that language, Gaelic, which was so preeminently the speech of Ireland. Whatever their tongue, it was not Gaelic. On the revival of literature in the 11th century, says Mr. Walker, in his historical memoirs of the Irish bards, the order of the bards was divided into two classes. Example, Olam re Senocos and Olam Redan, doctors or learned men of genealogy and of poetry or song. The Olam Hen re Senog Shot were historians and antiquaries. Their office was confined to certain families, and they held their properties by hereditary right. The Olam Hen Redan were panegyrist or rhapsodist, in whom the characters of the troubadour and jongleur of Provence seem to have been united. And the same writer quotes this from Stanihurst's description of Ireland, compiled from several authors of this period. The tongue, or sample tongue, or language, of these minstrels is sharp and sententious, and offereth great occasion to quick apophthegms and proper allusions. Wherefore the common jesters and rhymers, whom they term bards, all right, the rhymers, rappers, right, are said to delight passingly these that conceive the grace and property of the tongue. But the true Irish indeed differeth so much from that they commonly speak. The Scots one in 500 can either read, write, or understand it. Thus the common jesters and rhymers of early Ireland, whose business it was to bard and flatter certain Gaelic-speaking families, these jugglers possess a language that no one in 500 of the Gaelic people could read, write, or understand. These men were identical with the black-skinned minstrel jugglers of the John of Rampine story and with the bards and professed peasants of the Scottish Highlands. In their most striking characteristics, and in at least two of these instances, the language of such people was black speech. All right, see how they're labeling them? Since therefore there are particular accounts of those non-Gaelic classics recorded by the Gaelic-speaking families of Ireland, if not of Scotland, it may be taken as probable that a great deal of information regarding their outward appearances yet existing in ancient Irish books and manuscripts, and it can hardly be believed that such information will contradict the scanty items that have been gathered in these pages. And guys, we've gone over those records he's talking about, those chronologies, those annals, and they coincide with what he's saying about the original people, all right, and where they're really coming from. Whether regarded as gypsies or as members of various Pictish races, those Islemen or Iselmen, whom we have just been looking at, must have been Faws or painted men. So great was the race mixture in that archipelago that there must have been every variety of painted and tattooed men among them, ruddled like the Galloway chief, wood-stained like the archaic Greenman, tattooed like the famous Donald Ruck, and other iron-graved Moors. All melanated people they're just talking about, so-called black folks right there he just mentioned. Probably an investigation of ancient chronicles with this subject in view will result in discovering numberless instances of this, all right? And that's what we're doing, corroborating the fact that one division of the Gauls became known as the seat of Ruadri or Rotri, Roderick, listen, Rory or Rory, whose name signified alternatively the chief of the Tawny or red people, copper-colored, huh? And the Tawny or red chief, the copper-colored chief, renders it likely that this tribe of swarthy devils, as the Gaelic poem politely calls them, used to smear themselves over with iron ore, as in the historical cases already cited, and indeed the fact that Ruad signifies tawny as well as red, many also beheld May it also be held to support this belief that others were wood-stained, right, mahogany, wood-stained green men like the savages of the popular memory and of history is shown by the prevalence of the title Gorm after the names of islanders. This word, it has been noticed, is translated either blue or green, just as the Romans styled a certain ancient Britons, Carule and Viridis, indifferently, for the reason that the color of wood or gorman may be described by either adjective. As an agnomen, gorm must at one time or another have become fossilized, perhaps at different dates in different families. It is usually translated blue or green in such connections without any attempt to explain the meaning of the appellation. The many agnomens that denote the colors black, brown, tawny, gray, red, yellow, white are usually rendered black, etc., haired as formerly observed, black haired. And no doubt this translation is sometimes correct, but it was evident to any translator that blue and green could never relate to the hair, and so the many Donalds and Duncans bearing this title have been abruptly introduced to us as Blue Donald or Blue Duncan, without any attempted explanation of so odd a nickname. I listen to what they're telling you here. In one instance, I have seen it rendered blue-eyed, but against this there is the twofold objection that it might as well have been translated green-eyed, and also that such a free acceptation of one's colored nickname would entitle one to render the others as black, red, or yellow-eyed, with as much reason as black, red, or yellow-haired. The real solution of the difficulty seems undoubtedly to be that certainly in the case of Gorham, and probably in a large number of other cases, no direct reference is made either to hair or to eyes, all right? They're not talking about that because they try to say, oh, he was black, or Gorham, which meant dark skin, complexion. They try to, oh no, they were talking about the eyes, they were talking about the hair. So this is what he's trying to point out. The date of which Gorham lost his original significance and became a mere hereditary name as meaningless as the surnames White, Black, and Brown now are, cannot be decided. As just suggested, it probably became fossilized at various dates in various races. Gorm the Old, the fierce old pagan Dane who died in the year 935 and who was ancestor of Swen and Nude of England, was likely sustainably named, being presumably Gorm the wood-colored man. All right, it's because of his complexion. That's what they were talking about. Just as his contemporary Dub, the Niger, or the Black Dub of Scotland, the Black Man. Remember Kenneth? There is a traditionary story of a certain age which comes in Mr. Campbell's West Highland Tales, and which very clearly relates to the staining, or perhaps to the tattooing of a chief's daughter by the magicians or druids. And although in his English version of the incident he does not give the words that refer to its most important point, important at any rate for the present purpose, it is certain that the word Gorm must have been used by the narrator. The king of Ailp, the story goes, quarreled with the druids and was killed, leaving a single daughter and a son. She was educated by the druids till she was able to do many of their tricks, but they colored her skin as green as grass. This last phrase is exactly that one definition of Gorm implies. Gorm, blue of whatever shade, also green as grass, that the druids whose name in several forms came gradually to mean gypsies, fortune tellers, sorcerers, etc., had tattooed or stained this girl's skin is as clear as can be. Another instance of somewhat a similar kind is seen, and at a far later date, in a well-authenticated family sketch also given by Mr. Campbell. Although the traditional account of the affair is very much garbled, it is impossible to avoid the conviction that in it we have a distinct example of the epithet Gorm applied to an individual in its original sense. The incident belongs to the period of the Barber's Act that gave the Ladies' Rock at the inner entrance of the Sound of Mull its title, and which is familiar to everyone who has visited Oban or read William Black's novels, or indeed any collection of West Highland traditions. The savage chief of the MacLeans had sent his wife to a cruel death, as he thought, on this tidal Ladies' Rock, and after they had carried out their barbarous orders, these very men, says Mr. Campbell, returned to Duart Castle, where John Gorham, the first of the family of Lucknell, a boy of 3 or 4 years of age, was dwelling, with his aunt, the Lady MacLean, whom they had left upon the naked rock. She, as is known, was rescued, but with her we are not concerned here. And as soon as they had entered the castle of Duart, they kindled a great fire on the middle of the hall floor, and formed themselves into a circle around the fire, and caused strip the boy John Gorham naked, and placed him between them and the fire, where the boy, by reason of the heat, was forced to run around the fire, while each of them, as he passed within the circle, rubbed his naked skin with an hot roasted apple, which occasioned blue spots on the boy's skin ever after, for which he was called John Gorham, or Blue John. All right, pretty crazy story, right? As it stands, the story is manifestly absurd. The effect of repeated dabs with roasted apples could never result in this, if ever the bizarre experiment was tried. It is probable that the conclusion has arisen in this way. The Gaelic ubhal, an apple, is plainly a near relation of the adjective ubgel, hell, elliptical. Now the tale in which the ubhal figures is 3 or 4 centuries old. It relates to a time when a practice was which existed in the time of Gross the antiquary, and even yet must have been much more widely practiced. To make these punctured figures iron grave, there must have been an instrument, briquet. As likely as not, it was elliptical in shape. It was ubhale. If so, it would as likely have an alternative name denoting its shape, some noun very like ubhal, if not identical with it. This is probable since ubhal, pronounced oval, is virtually oval, or egg-shaped, from Latin ovum, Gaelic ub, of, an egg, so that ubhal, the noun, would thus originally indicate anything oval, or approaching that figure, in fact, an oval. But when the custom of tattooing became obsolete in the Hebrides, and in consequence, the tattooing instrument, also this meaning of the noun ubhal would also become obsolete, so that the modern narrator of the story knowing no such nouns except ub, an egg, and ubhal, an apple, would take for granted the ubhal of Blue John's experience was the only ubhal she knew by this name. The incident is also interesting in this way that it indicates that the Viridis, Kaweruli, or green men, did not paint their skins with wood dyed, but picket it in after the fashion of the existing Chattan or Gypsies of Egypt, the Dyaks of Borneo, and the official descendants of the Frisians, our own sailors who produced the blue color by means of gunpowder and of Indian ink. If wood, therefore, was invariably applied in this way, Gorham would be included in the latter term, brek. This Blue John then was clearly not nicknamed after the color of his eyes or of his hair, but of his skin. The story does not warrant us in believing that tattooing was a custom of his paternal tribe, the Campbells, for he was a son of Colin Campbell, 3rd Earl of Argyll. On the contrary, the usage was apparently familiar to the followers of MacLean, who perpetrated the act. The origin of the Campbells has been much disputed, and probably their pedigree is as mixed as that of most British people. One of them was certainly a Black Colin of Rome, and the West Highland traditions speak of swarthy men from Lorne and the Black Knights of Lockaway. All right, I'm talking about Campbells, but probably, as in every tribe and nation that has endured for many centuries, the ruling dynasty has changed over and over again. At that period, the MacLeans and the Campbells seem to have been ranged on different sides, although Blue John's aunt, his father's sister, had married the savage MacLean chief. This, however, might have been racially an alliance of a rough Pocahontas nature. Altogether, without fuller information, it is not easy to decide as to the side on which the green man preponderated, nor is such knowledge needed or needful at this juncture. Alexander Smith tells us a story of a MacDonald of Sleat, Donald Gorham, or Blue Donald, as he was called, who is another example of this usage. Sir Walter Scott, also in the history of Donald the Hammerer, introduces a similar specimen in the person of the celebrated Highland, wine, or green Coland. This personal application of the adjective uan or wine green is seemingly very rare, and it is also very instructive, for it again brings to memory that the black man, again, the black man of Scottish Gaelic Duin Dub, is the green man, all right? The jolly green giant, the green man. Doff is the green man. Is actually the black man, all right? Again, for it again brings to memory that the black man of Scottish Gaelic Duin or Dub is the green man, guys. Duin Gorn, it is the green man or the blue man of the Gaelic of Ireland. It does so in this way. The same word that is here translated green, Uain or Uan, is in another place rendered dark colored. Okay, that's what it really means, dark colored. The spelling in this instance corresponds with that now in use in what we call, with very little reason, the English language. It is spelled wan. It is a question whether, in the days of Harry the Minstrel, the dark-colored sense of the word was expressed by the quickened intonation, or whether he and his contemporaries still gave it the dissyllabic utterance that its green signification still possesses in the more archaic speech. But at any rate, this twin meaning of wand, right? Wand means dark colored, and doing gorn makes one long to learn more precisely the exact ethnological position of those southern tribes of whom this gorm custom was a characteristic. At the time of Caesar's landing, this, however, is a side question. The precise date at which tattooing or painted ceased to be a Hebridean custom cannot easily be fixed. Although Boswell does not mention it, it is quite within the bounds of possibility that the black-haired, half-naked Macleod, true descendant of the Black Prince of Man, who pulled an oar in the doctor's boat and who was something between a wild Indian and an English tar, resembled either of these in the possession of this peculiarity. The comparatively recent date of Johnson's journey offers no obstacle whatever to such an assumption, for that was the era of growth, when gypsies were still accustomed to artificially discolor their faces, the era of the Galloway pig marshal, and the era when English tars had not yet forsaken the Mongolian pigtail, and most certainly had not forsaken the custom of tattooing their bodies. In none of these cases, Blue John, Blue Donald, and Green Colin is there direct evidence that the green man was a black man, and in the first example the probability is quite the other way, for the rule of the Black Knights over that clan had probably by that time yielded to the supremacy of a fairer race, either by the overthrow of a dynasty, as in the case of the Black Douglas nobles, all right, we read about in previous chapters, remember, half a century earlier, or by repeated intermarrying of swarthy chiefs, generations after generation, with members of the fair-skinned races, Gaels, Norsemen, Normans, and others. Gosh, the hijack. Are those really all fair-skinned? And so, now that I remember, a lot of those Black Douglases, nobles that got, overthrown, they became your robbers, your thieves, your murderers, your minstrels, the gypsies that were in the forest that we were just reading about earlier. That's what I was saying. The revolution, gradual or sudden, must have taken place sometime or another, perhaps before the time of John Gorm, perhaps after, for the eminent chieftain of that race who has given the tradition to the public remarks elsewhere that his clansmen regard light yellow hair as one of the belongings of a Campbell. Also, the fact that the tattooing of John Gorm was performed by his enemies and strongly resented by his friends apparently indicates that it was not a custom of his race, while it undoubtedly was a black usage. Okay? The conclusion which one naturally reaches after regarding the foregoing evidence on this question fragmentary though it be, is therefore that the black breed and the blue squadron, as Gross puts it, were identical, and that the members of this squadron, in whatever part of our islands they existed, even so lately as Gross's time, represented the least civilized portion of our population, as civilization, in parentheses, is now understood, that in fact the archaic term of green man is fitly rendered savage, right? Because he's in the green forest, right? And although the strangling examples we have taken of the Caledonian green men do not distinctly say so, yet the presumption is that such blue Duncans and green Donalds are to be identified with the savages who molested peaceable churchgoers in the Hebrides some centuries ago, and with the pirates, robbers, creekmen, sorners, and vagabonds, generally who plundered travelers by land and sea, and whose homes and lurking places were appropriately named when they received such titles as Eileen Dub, or on the northwestern and the Black Isle. So remember, Eileen Dub means the island of the blacks, on the northeastern coast of Scotland. To what extent such marauders shared the usual fate of lawbreakers, or how many of them are represented in the great army of modern Britons, is another matter altogether, all right? When we talk about modern people. But what is more to the point is that in this, as in every other feature to which attention has been drawn, the particular section of the heterogeneous, Scotch people whom we have been regarding are plainly nothing else than gypsies. The people who we now know by this name have so dwindled down in numbers and importance, have become so much less formidable in character, their appellation bears now such a restricted meaning that it requires something of an effort to realize everything that is meant by this term. Even so lately as the time of Gross, the Blue Squadron was composed of thieves and marauders, of a notorious member of the Dick Turpine Brotherhood being handed down to posterity as blue skin, and that even such recent blue skins were in some degree or another of the black breed, all right, is likely more reasons than one. Black is a very unusual prefix to the names of highwaymen and robbers everywhere. Black Ralph in England, Black Peter in Holland, and many others. Not to stray, however, from Scotland, the author of Waverley has given us, whether by design or not, several instances of this. One of these most famous freebooters was Roderick Dub. Another of minor importance was Black Donaka in the heart of Midlothian, and the very frequent occurrence of the descriptive epithet Dub in the names of Highland and Island chiefs, as well as the equally frequent occurrences of various names denoting varying degrees of blackness, points most distinctly to the complexion of such leaders, okay? Do you understand what you're hearing, what we're seeing, what we're reading here? True history, distinctly to the complexion of such leaders, the blackness of these Highland and Island chiefs, the historical races then, whose ways and attributes have been, after a too imperfect and desultory fashion, examined within the last few chapters, are plainly represented more exactly by the Scottish gypsies of today than by any other section of the population of Scotland, descended, though that population is in great measure from the same ancestral stock. One particular instance of this identity could not, we saw, be ignored even by the Scotch gypsy historian himself when describing the culinary operations of this singular people, to use his own most ill-timed expression. All right, so remember, this is written in 1884. Nor could Sir Walter Scott omit to make a similar observation in a note to Guy Mannering, Note F, on the subject of gypsy superstitions. As these are detailed by a writer in Blackwood's magazine, he makes this remark: these notions are not peculiar to the gypsies, but having been once generally entertained among the Scottish common people, are now only found among those are the most rude in their habits and most devout of instruction. And this so exactly hits the mark, and it was said by a man who was such a zealous antiquary, and who must have known that gypsies were Picts, and who certainly knew that they were marauding moss troopers, even in his own day, that it is a perpetual wonder how Scott did not see that the wandering Egyptians, all right, were only the residuum of the historical Scots, okay? The case is put pretty correctly by Robert Jameson. In his introduction to Bird's letters, he refers, of course, solely to the Highlands and the Isles of Scotland, from the account to be found in various parts of his works, particularly in the Gartmore manuscript. It will be seen that from the manner in which the lands, the superiority of which belonged to the chief of a clan, were proportioned out by division and subdivision according to proximity of blood to the cadets of great families, invading families, the aboriginal inhabitants of the country must in the end have actually shouldered out of existence because no means were left for their support. These men attached by habit, language, and prejudice to their native country, upon which they had little claim, but for benevolence became sorners and sturdy beggars, and were tolerated and supported as the Lazzaroni were in Naples and in as Abraham men and sturdy beggars of all sorts were in England after the suppression of the monasteries and before there was any regular parochial provision for the poor. It is of such people that Bert speaks when he says, in his 24th letter, besides these ill-minded people among the clans, there are some stragglers in the hills who, like our gypsies, have no certain habitation, only they do not stroll about in numbers like them. These go singly, and though perfectly unknown, do not beg at the door, but without invitation or formal leave, go into a hut and sit themselves down by the fire, expecting to be supplied with oatmeal for their present food. To what extent these were aborigines and native men, one can only guess. To the Norman and Dutch settlers who, after the Norman conquest, became the rulers of a great part, if not all, of Great Britain, the descendants of 9th century Danes were native men. All right, so they were starting to call these invaders, right? The Normans, they were saying, oh, well, we're the natives. The Moors of the district of Moravia, listen, the Moors of the district of Moravia, future videos, ousted by incoming Flemings and Normans, need not have been descended from the Maori of Claudian, and may have been only natives of 3 centuries standing, their ancestors being the Danes or Black Heathen, but to the newcomers they would be aborigines, as much as the Tasmanians of today, who are all of European stock. Listen, what he's telling you. They're not ancient in that part of the world. They were coming from Europe. And I think we have future researches and studies on this and what we're calling Australioids. Where are they really coming from? Even in their own legends, they'll tell you that they came from somewhere else. All right? Would be aborigines. So they're saying this guy, Tasmanians of today, where all European stock would be aborigines to a possible race of successful invaders in the year 2150. Or again, such Moors may have been a mixture of earlier Maori and later Danes, but these are matters of pure speculation. The Gartmore manuscript, which was made public by Scott, describes the Highlanders of 1747. Thus, the commonalty are of a smaller size than the people of the Low Country, and as they are not accustomed to any hard labor and are in the constant use of hunting, fowling, and following their cattle through the mountains, they are of wonderful agility of body and capable to travel with ease at a great rate. The tacksmen, or good men, as well as the gentry, are generally larger-bodied men than the inferior sort. The people are extremely prolific, and therefore so numerous that there is not a business in that country, according to its present order and economy, for above the one half of them. The other half then must be idle and beggars, while in the country, that is, there are in the highlands no fewer than 150,000 poor people, and of these there are 28,750 able-bodied men between the ages of 18 and 56 fit to bear arms. Of the 115,000, a large number, says the manuscript, work honestly as herders, harvesters, etc., in the Low Countries, but then the rest of these people must be supported in the highlands, where they constantly reside, as they gain nothing. These we cannot suppose under one half of the whole number, so that there are in that country 57,500 souls who live, so many of them upon charity, and who are vagrant beggars through the highlands and the borders of it. Many of them live in an idle, sauntering life among their acquaintance and relations and are supported by their bounty. Others get a livelihood by blackmail contracts, by which they receive certain sums of money from people of substance in the country who abstain from stealing their cattle, and the last class of them paying their expense by stealing, robbing, and committing depredations. Every place is full of idle people, accustomed to arms and lazy in everything but rapines and depredations. A person who had the greatest correspondence with the thieves was agreed with to preserve the lands contracted for from thefts, for certain sums to be paid yearly out of these lands. Upon this fund he employed one half of the thieves to recover stolen cattle, and the other half of them to steal in order to make this agreement and blackmail contract necessary. He calls himself the captain of the watch, and his banditti go by that name. And as this gives them a kind of authority to traverse that country, so it makes them capable of doing much mischief. There is paid in blackmail or watch money, openly and privately, 5,000 that pounds, and there is a yearly loss by understocking the grounds by reason of thefts of at least 15,000 pounds, which altogether a loss to landlords and farmers in the highlands of 37,000 pounds sterling a year. One cannot draw a hard and fast line between the two classes, into which the populations of the Scotch highlands was at that time thus divided. That is to say, from an ethnological point of view, it would be contrary to all the teaching of history and of ethnology to suppose that this could be done, assuming that after the Norman conquest, the aristocracy of the highlands was composed chiefly of an element introduced subsequently to that conquest, as history seems to indicate, and as a great number of highland genealogies assert, okay, that eventually, the Norman conquest, the Stuarts, they were Normans, so eventually they became part of the nobles of the highlands of Scotland, all right, or Highlanders. It is certain that about 600 years after the arrival of the intruders, the two castes would not be found existent side by side, unaffected by the blood of either. No such thing has ever happened or can ever happen. A race of half-breeds, and ultimately a jumble of both races and every variety of degree, would assuredly be the result of the invasion. The Mac-Ross, for example, of Johnson's time, all right, Mac-Ross were in some cases as black and wild as any American savages whatever, just like the American Indians as black and wild, while others were as comely as Sappho. The pedigrees of the other clans show a similar mixture, the result of which is seen in the greatly blended races of the Hebrides and of the Highlands, whose complexions have been remarked upon by various travelers. And one curious outcome of this is that many of the West Highland tales related of black fishermen, black thieves, dusky young men, and women are told by people whose physical features are more allied to the swarthy than to the white-skinned side of their ancestry. Okay, listen, although the stories in which such phrases occur must plainly have originated in the latter of these branches. Therefore, although Black Duncan, the gypsy Chattan of the heart of Mid-Lothian, was accepted as typical of the robber caste, and the resident laird, presumably a white man, presumably, as the representative of the law-abiding and reputable Highlanders, whose existence is apparent in all the allusions of travelers and in all the statutes against sorners and thieves which have been quoted. Yet in each of these two main divisions, there must have been a large number of hybrids. All right, it wasn't just white on one side or just black on on one side. They were kind of mixed. There was all kinds of shades on both sides, is what he's saying. Many who were born in one caste must have passed into the other. This was actually stated in the Gartmore manuscript. Feuds and differences among families in that country do not little contribute to promote this mischief. Thieving, stealing, and robbing by means of villains kept thus independence and under absolute command, being the common way of resenting quarrels against one another. In the earlier part of last century, thefts, robberies, rapines, and depredations became so common that they began to be looked upon as neither shameful nor dishonorable, and people of a station somewhat above the vulgar did sometimes countenance, encourage, nay, head gangs of bandits and those detestable villainies. All right, remember this was from 1884. So when you say it's a century earlier or the last century, you gotta, keep that in mind. This latter feature was aptly typified in the person of MacDonald of Barrisdale, of whom our author says that this gentleman descended of the Glengarry family by the indolence and negligence of the head of that tribe, procured to himself such advantages and such interest with that branch of the clan that he was able to force an extensive highland neighborhood, where are people of no small interest, to contribute to him a very considerable sum yearly for their protection. But Barrisdale and others like him belong to a period subsequent by many generations to the days of Buchanan, when the creeks and forests of the Caledonian Islands were infested with Vikings and robbers, and as the differences of race and customs were more strongly marked at that and earlier dates, it is better for our purpose that we should regard these times more particularly than those that are nearer our own day. The genuine banditti of the highlands and islands, therefore, were of kindred race, okay, to speak broadly, and that kinship antedated the Norman conquest, same peoples before the Normans. In the words of Bailey MacWeebill, from the mist ancient times of record, the lawless thieves, limers, and broken men of the highlands had been in fellowship together by reason of their surnames for the committing of diverse thefts, reefs, and hardships upon the honest men of the low country, all which was directly prohibited in diverse parts of the statute book, both by the Act 1567 and various others, the Wilkes statutes, were shamefully broken and vilipended by the said sorners, limers, and broken men associated into fellowships for the aforesaid purposes of theft, cut reef, fire raisin, murder, raptus, mulerum, or forcible abduction of women, and such like as aforesaid. The other terms used in the laws that were passed for the suppression of such marauders were, it will be remembered, such as these sorcerers, bards, prophets, plaisants, clowns, sturdy beggars, thieves, idle bellies, and intolerable oppressors, all of which it was noticed applied equally to the Scots, mosers, or bog trotters, and thieves of the borders, as well as to their later representatives, the Egyptians, or Gypsies, okay, so called. And the same likeness that was discernible between the historical Scots and Picts of southern Scotland and the scattered wanderers just spoken of is visible as clearly in the northern and western portions of that country. Certain sections of the population of Scotland, not hitherto regarded as gypsies, have distinctly their ancient ways and customs more fully represented by that lightly esteemed caste than by any other division of our fellow countrymen at the present day. This identity was evident wherever we looked at particular sections of the Scottish people of the Northwest, in the fashion of their dwellings, whether turf-built wigwam, all right, wigwam, or skin or canvas covered tent, and the appearance of the people, in their dusky complexion, plaited hair, right, braided, bright-colored garments, the kerchiefs of the women, again, bright-colored garments, just like these so-called West African tribes, right? Their ornaments of coral, silver, and in some cases jewels, in their painted and tattooed skins, in their avowed polygamy, and their primitive culinary customs, and such things as the manufacture of horn utensils and of pottery, and the oath taken upon the dirk and the dirk itself, and their favorite instruments of music, the harp, the violin, the bagpipe, and in their love of song and minstrelsy, in their practice of the arts of the seer, the magician, and the mountebank, and lastly, in the habits which made them known as sorners, idlers, intolerable oppressors, depredators of the fiercest kind, murderers. And those last characteristics, unamiable though they be, are by no means the least important, for they point back to the time when the Sorners were Sorohen, or chiefs, ruling over a territory, which was ultimately taken from them. That's why they became that, all right, guys? By strangers, and over a tribe whose members by degrees acknowledged another allegiance, as finally they were obliged to do themselves, however reluctantly, although at the Cladah and among the scattered and wasted tribes of Gypsies, there still exists a shadowy kingship, a feeble imperium in imperio. Yet those tribal kings have very limited sway, and if by any chance their laws and those of the nation should jar against each other, there is no question as to which must be obeyed. But the existence of these relations is a fact of the deepest meaning. All right, and that is the end of this chapter, guys. This is our just notes. This is how long the source note is for the last page. So they're talking about what they're just talking about, kind of summarizing. But that's the end of this chapter. I hope you guys enjoyed the reading. It was a lot of pages, but a lot of good information. I enjoyed reading to you guys. Do you guys see all this history that they didn't tell us about? And just how they hid all these melanated people of the British Isles, all these original indigenous people, and also these so-called invaders, conquerors, these Black Danes, these Normans, as well, all these people being described as melanated, dark-skinned, swarthy. So again, this was chapter 14 of the book Ancient and Modern Britons, volume 1. That was the end of book 1. We're going to get into book 2 next, still in volume 1. We're not in volume 2 yet. Book 2 is not that long. A couple of chapters. We're going to definitely read those. All right, coming up. Thanks for taking the time to hear me read out loud to you guys. I really appreciate that. Thanks for tuning in if you were here live in the chat. I appreciate all of you guys in the chat and everybody listening after. Thank you for taking the time to do that. A lot of good information. I hope you guys got all the drop. If you're new to the series, make sure to catch the previous episodes or parts. Again, this was part 9 of this installment. We're in chapter 14. Here we just read, and we're going to continue reading volume 1 and get into volume 2 as well. Much love and respect. Pura vida, mi gente. Awa!